The streets of New York City in the 1950 seconds were alive with a restless energy. The kind that whispered promises of wealth and power to those daring enough to seize them. It was a city divided by ambition and fear. A city where loyalties were fragile, and the wrong decision could cost a life before the night was over. In this world of shadowed alleys, smoky nightclubs, and clandestine boardrooms, a man moved with a quiet authority, commanding influence without fanfare, shaping the destiny of organized crime with calculated precision. That man was Tommy Lucchese, a figure whose name would eventually echo through the annals of mafia history, though few would ever see him as the true force behind the scenes. Born in Palermo, Sicily, in 1899, Tommy Lucchese came to America as a young boy, carrying with him not only the dreams of his family, but also a deep understanding of the structures of power and loyalty that had defined his homeland. From the outset, Lucchese exhibited a sharp mind and an instinctive understanding of human nature. He was observant, quiet, and patient, a man who knew that power was most potent when exercised subtly. While others sought to make their names known through violence or spectacle, Lucchese preferred to build his empire with silence, careful strategy, and the meticulous cultivation of allies in every corner of New York's criminal underworld. By the time the 1950 seconds arrived, Lucchese had already established himself as a rising force among the five families, the dominant mafia organizations that divided New York City into spheres of influence. His approach was methodical. He understood that to control the city's criminal enterprises, one needed more than muscle. One needed networks, loyalty, and an almost surgical precision in executing plans. Lucchese's quiet demeanor belied a mind constantly analyzing threats and opportunities, calculating the optimal moves in a complex game where a single misstep could provoke war or collapse an empire. Tommy's influence was not built in a single moment of brutality, as so many others thought power required. Instead, he cultivated it slowly, gaining respect through shrewd negotiation, investment in profitable ventures, and strategic alliances. He had a knack for identifying individuals who could be useful, assessing their strengths, weaknesses, and ambitions, and placing them in positions where they would advance his interests without ever realizing they were serving his broader plan. In the smoky backrooms of Manhattan clubs, deals were brokered quietly, often without the need for overt threats. Lucchese understood that the perception of control was as valuable as control itself. One of Lucchese's most significant strategies was his approach to crime as a business. He recognized early on that the chaotic violence that characterized many mafia operations could be counterproductive, drawing unwanted attention from law enforcement and rival factions. He preferred subtlety, discretion, and efficiency, focusing on profitable operations like gambling, loan sharking, and labor racketeering. By controlling unions and key industries, he created revenue streams that were both legal in appearance and profitable in reality. These moves allowed him to amass wealth and influence without drawing the kind of violent scrutiny that plagued more flamboyant mobsters. Despite his quiet nature, Tommy Lucchese was not without ruthlessness. He understood that to maintain authority, there had to be consequences for betrayal or incompetence. But his approach was rarely impulsive. Unlike others who resorted to violence as a first measure, Lucchese employed it strategically, ensuring that each act sent a clear message to both allies and adversaries. The stories of men disappearing without warning, of sudden accidents that eliminated competition, served to reinforce his reputation without requiring public displays of brutality. In a world where fear could be as effective as respect, Lucchese mastered the delicate balance between the two. His influence extended beyond the streets. Lucchese had a profound understanding of politics and law enforcement. He cultivated relationships with officials, businessmen, and union leaders, creating a network of influence that reached into the highest echelons of the city. These connections were not merely transactional. They were part of a carefully orchestrated system in which information flowed both ways, allowing Lucchese to anticipate threats, exploit opportunities, and maintain an upper hand in negotiations that would have stymied less perceptive men. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Tommy Lucchese's rise was his ability to operate invisibly in a world where visibility often meant vulnerability. While many of his contemporaries craved headlines, notoriety, or the approval of the criminal elite, Lucchese moved in shadows, preferring that his influence be felt rather than seen. Decisions were executed with precision, often leaving rivals and allies alike unaware of the full extent of his involvement until the outcomes became apparent. This approach allowed him to consolidate power while minimizing exposure, a strategy that would later define his tenure as the head of the Lucchese crime family. The 1950 seconds also brought challenges. Rival families, ambitious lieutenants, and law enforcement pressure constantly tested Lucchese's patience and judgment. But each challenge was met with calculation rather than impulse. He understood that in the long game of organized crime, endurance and foresight were more valuable than immediate gain. Deals were negotiated with careful attention to long-term consequences. Alliances were nurtured to ensure loyalty, and threats were neutralized in ways that reinforced his reputation without unnecessary bloodshed. By the mid-1950 seconds, Tommy Lucchese had achieved a status that few outside his immediate circle fully understood. He was not the loudest voice in the mafia, nor was he the most feared for direct violence. Instead, he was the silent architect, the strategist, whose careful planning and quiet authority allowed him to shape events from behind the scenes. The families, unions, and criminal enterprises he touched were stronger and more organized under his guidance, and his reputation for shrewdness, discretion, and effectiveness earned him respect that would endure long into the next decade. Lucchese's story in 1957, the year that would later be remembered as a turning point in his ascent, reflects a man who understood the subtleties of power in a way that few could match. While others relied on intimidation or spectacle, Lucchese's strength lay in his mind, his patience, and his ability to anticipate and manipulate events to his advantage. The quiet power he wielded allowed him to build an empire that was resilient, profitable, and respected, a legacy that would cement his place in the annals of organized crime history. In the end, Tommy Lucchese's life during this period was a testament to the power of silence, strategy, and careful cultivation of influence. He showed that in a world driven by chaos and violence, the true measure of power was not in the volume of one's threats but in the subtle, deliberate actions that shape outcomes without the world ever realizing who is truly in control. And in the story of New York's underworld, few names would come to symbolize that principle as effectively as Tommy Lucchese, the silent power behind the mafia. The city's nights carried a rhythm all their own, a pulse of neon lights reflecting off wet asphalt, distant sirens wailing like warnings, and the faint hum of conversations that never reached the ears of those walking the streets in ordinary daylight. For Tommy Lucchese, the night was both shield and instrument, a time when deals could be brokered, allegiances tested, and plans set in motion without the interference of public scrutiny. Unlike other men who wielded power through visibility or brute force, Lucchese had learned early that control was most effective when invisible, the hand guiding events from the shadows, shaping outcomes while leaving onlookers to speculate. By 1957, Lucchese's influence had begun to crystallize into a network that spanned the entirety of New York's criminal ecosystem. He had eyes and ears in every corner, from the bustling docks of Brooklyn, where shipments of goods could be manipulated for profit, to the boardrooms of Manhattan, where unions and businesses intersected with the interests of organized crime. Every connection he cultivated was purposeful, every relationship carefully weighed for loyalty and utility. Lucchese understood that in the intricate chessboard of mafia politics, a misplaced pawn could threaten the stability of an entire family. Despite the sophistication of his operations, Lucchese remained intimately involved in the details. He did not rely solely on proxies to execute his vision. He knew the importance of understanding every transaction, every alliance, and every potential threat firsthand. In the smoky back rooms of speakeasies and private clubs, he listened more than he spoke, absorbing the nuances of conversations, interpreting subtle shifts in tone or hesitation that might signal deception or opportunity. His reputation for attentiveness and discernment became a tool in itself. Men who attempted to cheat or mislead him quickly realized that Lucchese's silence was never empty, but a sign that every word was being cataloged and assessed. Lucchese's approach to business was meticulous. He viewed organized crime as an enterprise requiring management, foresight, and long-term strategy. Unlike the more flamboyant gangsters of the era, whose violent outbursts often drew police attention and media scrutiny, Lucchese preferred a model of quiet profitability. Gambling operations, loan sharking ventures, and labor rackets were not merely sources of immediate income. They were instruments of influence, channels through which he could extend his reach, enforce loyalty, and consolidate control over entire sectors of the city. By positioning himself as both a facilitator and protector of these enterprises, Lucchese created a sense of dependency that further cemented his authority. Even as his empire expanded, Lucchese remained acutely aware of the fragile balance that governed the underworld. Rival families, ambitious lieutenants, and the ever-present pressure of law enforcement demanded constant vigilance. Every decision carried weight. A poorly judged alliance or an overlooked rival could spark conflicts that might unravel years of careful work. Lucchese's strategy was rooted in foresight and patience. He preferred negotiation to confrontation, precision to impulsivity. Violence, when employed, was deliberate, targeted, and meaningful, sending unmistakable messages to those who might underestimate him. One of the keys to Lucchese's power was his ability to manage relationships with other mafia families without creating unnecessary conflict. He understood the value of compromise, of leveraging shared interests, and of recognizing when restraint could yield greater rewards than confrontation. His approach was calculated, rooted in a deep understanding of human nature and the unwritten codes of the criminal underworld. Alliances were nurtured, debts remembered, and favors carefully recorded not out of sentiment, but because the currency of loyalty and obligation was the most enduring form of power. Tommy's influence extended beyond the street-level operations of organized crime. He cultivated relationships with politicians, law enforcement officials, and business leaders, recognizing that control over legal and civic structures could be as crucial as control over the streets. These connections were subtle and discreet, often taking the form of quiet counsel, strategic advice, or financial support that went unnoticed by the public. Through these networks, Lucchese gained access to information and influence that allowed him to anticipate threats, manipulate outcomes, and maintain an upper hand in negotiations with rivals and authorities alike. Despite his ever-growing power, Lucchese maintained a personal code that distinguished him from others in the criminal world. He valued discretion, loyalty, and intelligence above bravado or recklessness. He did not seek the spotlight. He did not crave headlines or public recognition. Instead, his satisfaction came from the quiet exercise of influence, the subtle orchestration of events that ensured his family's dominance and profitability. Those who observed his methods often marveled at the efficiency of his operations, unaware that the real genius lay in the strategy that remained invisible to everyone but Lucchese himself. The mid-1950 seconds also brought challenges that tested Lucchese's resolve and judgment. Ambitious lieutenants within his own ranks occasionally sought to expand their influence at the expense of the family's cohesion. Rival families eyed opportunities to encroach on territory he controlled, and law enforcement agencies, increasingly sophisticated in their investigations, posed threats that required constant adaptation and careful planning. Yet, through it all, Lucchese remained composed, analyzing every scenario, predicting moves before they happened, and deploying solutions that reinforced his authority without unnecessary risk. One particularly tense period arose when disputes over union influence threatened to destabilize the delicate balance of power. Certain factions sought to challenge Lucchese's control over lucrative labor operations, testing both his patience and his strategic acumen. Rather than responding with immediate force, he opted for negotiation, using intermediaries to assess loyalties, gauge intentions, and identify weaknesses. Through a combination of careful diplomacy, financial leverage, and the occasional display of controlled intimidation, Lucchese was able to neutralize the threat, reaffirming his dominance while avoiding open conflict that could draw law enforcement scrutiny. Throughout these trials, Lucchese's personal demeanor remained consistent, calm, measured, and observant. He avoided the impulsive behavior that often characterized the actions of other mobsters, understanding that the appearance of control was as important as control itself. His presence in a room was subtle but commanding. A single word or gesture could redirect discussions, shift alliances, or convey consequences without the need for overt aggression. Men learned quickly that underestimating Lucchese was a dangerous error, and over time, his reputation for intelligence, patience, and strategic mastery became one of his most formidable tools. By the close of 1957, Lucchese had solidified a position that few rivals could challenge. He was not the loudest, the most feared, or the most visible figure in New York's criminal underworld, but his influence extended into every corner of the city's illicit economy. Through careful planning, strategic alliances, and a mastery of human behavior. He had created an empire that was resilient, profitable, and respected, a silent but undeniable force whose decisions would ripple through the mafia for years to come. Tommy Lucchese's rise during this period offers a window into the mechanics of power in a world governed by both fear and loyalty. He demonstrated that influence need not be theatrical to be absolute, that the careful orchestration of events could achieve far more than brute strength or impulsive violence. And in the shadowy streets and private boardrooms of 1952 New York, his quiet hand shaped the trajectory of organized crime, leaving a legacy of strategic brilliance that would define the Lucchese family for decades. The rhythm of New York City was relentless, a ceaseless current of ambition, danger, and opportunity. By the late 1952s, the city had become a complex labyrinth for those who understood its unspoken rules, a world where alliances could shift overnight, and fortunes could be made or lost in the flicker of an eye. Tommy Lucchese moved through this world with the composure of a man who had already learned the lessons of patience, observation, and calculated risk. Unlike many of his contemporaries, who relied on spectacle, fear, or brute force to assert control, Lucchese wielded power with the subtlety of a tactician, orchestrating events in ways that left even seasoned rivals unaware of the full scope of his influence. Lucchese's approach was rooted in his understanding of the city as a living organism, one in which every district, every business, and every individual could be leveraged to reinforce his authority. He recognized early that raw aggression alone was insufficient to maintain dominance. It attracted attention, invited retaliation, and destabilized the delicate equilibrium of alliances that was essential to long-term success. Instead, he relied on a combination of strategic negotiation, financial leverage, and psychological insight to extend his reach. By the time he was fully entrenched in the operations of the five families, Lucchese had become a master at managing both allies and adversaries, using influence, intimidation, and subtle persuasion in equal measure. One of the key areas of Lucchese's empire was the control of labor unions, particularly those connected to the shipping and garment industries. These unions were not merely sources of income. They were instruments of power that allowed him to influence major business decisions and, in some cases, entire industries. Lucchese understood that by controlling the flow of labor, he could dictate terms to employers, secure profitable contracts, and maintain leverage over both legitimate and illicit enterprises. This was a skill that required diplomacy, foresight, and, at times, calculated coercion. To those outside his circle, the unions appeared autonomous, but beneath the surface, Lucchese's guidance was steady, precise, and virtually invisible. The operation of these unions required constant attention. Lucchese monitored their activities closely, ensuring that leadership remained loyal and that any attempts at subversion were swiftly neutralized. He deployed trusted lieutenants to oversee day-to-day operations, but he always remained informed, capable of intervening decisively when necessary. This combination of delegation and personal oversight allowed him to maintain a high level of control without exposing himself unnecessarily. Men who underestimated him often discovered, too late, that every move they made had already been anticipated, every plan evaluated, and every loyalty tested. At the same time, Lucchese was expanding his influence in other sectors, carefully weaving a web that spanned the entire city. Nightclubs, gambling operations, and illicit trade routes became avenues not only for profit but for influence. By aligning himself with legitimate business figures, he blurred the lines between legal and illegal enterprises, ensuring that his power could operate both overtly and covertly. This dual approach required meticulous planning, a keen sense of timing, and an understanding of human nature that was rare even among the most seasoned criminals. Lucchese excelled in this arena, turning opportunities into leverage and leverage into long-term security. Lucchese's rise did not go unnoticed by other members of the mafia, many of whom were accustomed to asserting dominance through violence rather than strategy. While some viewed him as overly cautious, others recognized the brilliance of his approach. His reputation for patience and precision earned him respect, even among those who might have preferred confrontation. And in a world where impulsive behavior could lead to ruin, Lucchese's ability to maintain composure and act with calculated decisiveness set him apart from virtually everyone else. During this period, he also became adept at managing relationships with law enforcement and political figures. While many mobsters treated officials as obstacles to be bribed or intimidated, Lucchese approached these relationships with nuance and subtlety. He cultivated allies, exchanged favors, and ensured that key individuals were invested in his continued success. By doing so, he created a buffer of protection, a network of influence that allowed him to anticipate raids, avoid scrutiny, and maintain operational continuity even in the face of increased enforcement activity. These connections were built quietly, often imperceptibly, and they added a layer of security that many rivals lacked. Lucchese's personal style further reinforced his power. He dressed plainly, spoke sparingly, and never sought public attention. Unlike more flamboyant figures who drew headlines and police investigations, he moved through social and criminal circles with an unassuming air, masking the breadth and depth of his authority. Men came to understand that the lack of outward display was deliberate. It was a strategy that allowed him to operate efficiently while avoiding unnecessary risk. His influence was felt in boardrooms, union offices, and private meetings long before it became visible on the streets. By this time, Lucchese had also mastered the art of conflict resolution within his own family. Ambitious lieutenants, rival factions, and external threats all required careful management. He preferred to resolve disputes through negotiation, using leverage and psychological insight rather than indiscriminate violence. When force was necessary, it was precise and purposeful, designed to reinforce loyalty and send a clear message without provoking broader conflict. This strategic use of power minimized unnecessary risk, while maximizing control, reinforcing his reputation as both intelligent and formidable. Lucchese's personal philosophy was rooted in the idea that true power was not in fear alone but in the perception of competence and inevitability. He understood that men followed leaders they respected, feared, and ultimately trusted to navigate complex situations. By maintaining calm authority, strategic patience, and meticulous oversight, Lucchese created an environment in which loyalty was both voluntary and self-reinforcing. This approach allowed him to consolidate power more effectively than those who relied solely on intimidation or spectacle. As the city moved toward the late 1950s, Lucchese's empire was both expansive and resilient. He had cultivated networks across industries, unions, and neighborhoods, ensuring that his influence was embedded at multiple levels of the city's infrastructure. His control was subtle but pervasive. Even when he remained physically absent from a location, his presence was felt through the loyalty, discipline, and vigilance of those who acted on his behalf. Every decision, every alliance, every transaction was filtered through a mind that valued foresight, precision, and the quiet exercise of authority. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Lucchese's strategy was his ability to blend patience with decisiveness. He waited for the right moment to act, observing developments, assessing risks, and preparing contingencies. Yet when action was required, he moved swiftly, decisively, and with clarity of purpose. This balance allowed him to maintain control over a volatile world, turning challenges into opportunities, and ensuring that his influence continued to grow even amid the unpredictable dynamics of organized crime. By the end of this period, Lucchese had transformed from a rising figure into a central force within New York's criminal landscape. His empire was complex, multifaceted, and deeply entrenched, and his influence extended far beyond the streets, into the corridors of business, labor, and government. While many of his contemporaries relied on notoriety or violence to assert dominance, Lucchese's power was derived from strategy, discretion, and the careful orchestration of events. His story during this time offers a portrait of a man whose intelligence, patience, and calculated decisiveness allowed him to shape the underworld in ways that few could ever match, cementing his reputation as the silent power behind the mafia. The city hummed with a restless energy, each block a theater of ambition, risk, and opportunity. By the late 1950s, New York had become a labyrinth, where fortunes could be seized or destroyed within the span of a single evening, and the streets were as much a battlefield as the hidden offices where decisions were made. For Tommy Lucchese, navigating this intricate web required more than influence or muscle. It demanded a precise understanding of human behavior, a mastery of timing, and an uncanny ability to foresee consequences before they rippled through the underworld. Lucchese had learned early that power wielded carelessly was often fleeting, and the true mark of a strategist lay in the subtle orchestration of events that others only realized after the outcomes had been sealed. Lucchese's rise was not fueled by spectacle or headline-making violence. Instead, it was rooted in his exceptional ability to observe, anticipate, and manipulate the environment around him. He understood that the city operated on multiple levels, visible and invisible, legal and illicit, and that control required careful integration across these spheres. Whether it was a union contract negotiation, a shipment arriving at the Brooklyn docks, or a delicate arrangement with a city official, Lucchese treated each situation as a move in a larger game. He recognized that a single misstep could trigger conflict, weaken alliances, or draw law enforcement attention, and so he acted with deliberate patience, ensuring that each decision reinforced his power without unnecessary exposure. One of the hallmarks of Lucchese's approach was his strategic use of loyalty and obligation. Unlike mobsters who relied on fear alone, he cultivated a system in which men were invested in serving his interests because doing so was advantageous, safe, and ultimately inevitable. This required meticulous attention to the motivations, ambitions, and weaknesses of those around him. He rewarded loyalty with opportunities, protection, and trust, and he dealt with betrayal or incompetence decisively, but strategically, ensuring that consequences were visible yet measured. In this way, he created a culture in which allegiance was both voluntary and self-reinforcing, a foundation upon which his empire could flourish. The labor unions were a critical element of his influence, offering both financial gain and a lever of strategic power. Controlling unions in the shipping, construction, and garment industries gave Lucchese the ability to influence contracts, manipulate supply chains, and assert pressure on businesses without resorting to overt violence. His approach was subtle. Union leaders were carefully selected, their decisions guided through persuasion, negotiation, and, when necessary, the quiet demonstration of authority. Lucchese understood that the most effective control was often invisible, executed through intermediaries who understood the broader strategy but could never fully grasp the totality of his influence. Simultaneously, Lucchese was expanding his reach into entertainment and nightlife. Nightclubs, theaters, and private establishments became both sources of revenue and strategic instruments. They served as venues for deals, testing grounds for alliances, and even arenas to observe potential adversaries. Through these venues, he extended his network, connecting with business leaders, politicians, and influential figures who could be persuaded, leveraged, or aligned with his broader objectives. Each interaction was a calculated step in a larger plan, reinforcing Lucchese's influence while maintaining the discretion that had become his signature. Despite his growing empire, Lucchese remained deeply attuned to the human element of his operations. He understood that power was never static. It depended on perception, relationships, and the subtle interplay of fear, respect, and trust. He spent as much time observing conversations, gestures, and reactions as he did managing finances or operations. The quiet nod, the hesitation before a response, the manner in which a man carried himself in a room, all were data points that informed Lucchese's decisions. In this way, he maintained a level of situational awareness that few rivals could match, allowing him to anticipate problems, exploit weaknesses, and reinforce loyalty before challenges escalated. Lucchese's reputation for strategic intelligence and composure also gave him leverage in negotiations with rival families. While other leaders relied on intimidation or public displays of force, Lucchese preferred to approach disputes with calculation, exploiting opportunities to consolidate influence without provoking open conflict. This required a delicate balance of firmness and subtlety, ensuring that rivals understood his strength while minimizing the risks of escalation. Over time, this approach allowed him to build alliances that were both mutually beneficial and strategically advantageous, positioning him as a central figure in the coordination and management of organized crime across New York City. His relationships with law enforcement and political figures were equally calculated. Unlike others who viewed these connections solely as shields to be purchased, Lucchese recognized their potential as instruments of information, influence, and security. He cultivated discrete channels of communication, ensuring that critical information about investigations, threats, and opportunities could be accessed before they became immediate dangers. These relationships also allowed him to operate in a manner that appeared legitimate to outsiders, creating a buffer that protected both his operations and his reputation. Lucchese's mastery of this interplay between legality and criminality became a defining feature of his influence, allowing him to navigate a complex environment with remarkable efficiency. Violence, while present in his world, was never his first recourse. Lucchese understood that indiscriminate brutality invited attention, risk, and instability. When force was necessary, it was precise, targeted, and meaningful, sending clear messages to those who might challenge his authority. By reserving violence for strategic moments, he reinforced his reputation for intelligence and control, ensuring that fear complemented respect rather than undermining it. This strategic restraint became one of his most effective tools, allowing him to maintain dominance while avoiding unnecessary exposure or escalation. Lucchese's personal demeanor reinforced his power. He dressed plainly, spoke minimally, and carried himself with an air of quiet confidence. His presence in a room was subtle but commanding. He did not need to assert authority loudly because his reputation preceded him. Men learned quickly that Lucchese's calm, measured behavior was not indecision but a sign of calculated thought, and those who underestimated him often faced consequences that were swift, precise, and unavoidable. This combination of discretion, intelligence, and strategic foresight created an aura of inevitability around his actions, further solidifying his influence within both the criminal underworld and legitimate society. As the 1,950 seconds progressed, Lucchese's empire grew more sophisticated and resilient. He had cultivated networks across industries, unions, neighborhoods, and social circles, ensuring that his influence was embedded at every level of the city's infrastructure. The extent of his control remained largely invisible to outsiders, yet its effects were pervasive. Decisions made in private offices and smoky back rooms shaped labor contracts, business deals, and criminal alliances across the city. Lucchese's foresight, patience, and intelligence allowed him to anticipate challenges, exploit opportunities, and maintain stability in a volatile world, solidifying his reputation as one of the most formidable figures in organized crime. Through all of this, Tommy Lucchese's story was defined by his mastery of subtlety. He demonstrated that power did not require ostentation, that influence could be exerted quietly yet decisively, and that patience and strategy could achieve more enduring results than impulsive action or brute force. In the shadowed corridors of the city, in the hidden negotiations and quiet alliances, Lucchese's hand guided the course of events, shaping outcomes in ways that ensured both profitability and longevity. By the close of this period, he had established a foundation of control and influence that would define the Lucchese family for decades, leaving an indelible mark on the history of organized crime in New York City. The undercurrents of New York City in the late 1950 seconds moved quietly, almost imperceptibly, but for those attuned to the rhythms of influence and power, every whisper carried weight. Tommy Lucchese had long mastered the art of reading those undercurrents, understanding that true control depended not on the display of strength, but on the careful alignment of events, people, and opportunities. By this time, he had become a figure whose authority was respected, feared, and rarely questioned, not through spectacle, but through precision, foresight, and an uncanny sense of timing. The city's criminal ecosystem, from the bustling docks to the dimly lit back rooms of Manhattan, had become, in effect, an extension of his strategy, a living, breathing manifestation of his vision. Lucchese's operations were remarkably multifaceted. Unlike many of his contemporaries who relied heavily on brute force or reckless ambition, he approached his empire as a disciplined enterprise. Gambling operations, loan sharking, labor racketeering, and control of unions were not merely profit centers, they were instruments of influence. By securing dominance in key sectors, he could shape business decisions, manipulate economic outcomes, and exert subtle pressure on rivals without drawing unnecessary attention. Lucchese understood that power in the mafia was as much about perception as reality. Men who believed he controlled the levers of influence were often deterred from opposing him, even when they lacked complete information. The labor unions represented one of his most potent tools. In the shipping, construction, and garment industries, control of labor translated into both financial gain and strategic leverage. Contracts could be influenced, shipments delayed or expedited, and decisions swayed, all without overt conflict. Lucchese's approach was methodical. Trusted lieutenants ensured operations ran smoothly, but he remained closely informed, monitoring developments and maintaining the ability to intervene when necessary. By doing so, he ensured that loyalty was not just demanded, but strategically earned. Those who attempted to exploit weaknesses quickly discovered that Lucchese had anticipated the move long before it was attempted. Simultaneously, Lucchese expanded his reach into entertainment, nightlife, and legitimate business sectors. Nightclubs and theaters became venues for networking, negotiation, and observation. Through them, he connected with influential figures outside the immediate criminal world, establishing alliances with politicians, businessmen, and other power brokers. Each interaction was deliberate, a calculated step in a larger strategy that reinforced his position while maintaining discretion. Lucchese understood that influence extended beyond direct control. It was also about shaping perceptions, guiding behavior, and quietly orchestrating outcomes. Despite his vast operations, Lucchese remained intensely attuned to the human element. He observed behaviors, gestures, and speech patterns with a surgeon's precision, understanding that subtle cues often revealed more than words. Hesitation in a negotiation, a shift in tone, or even the placement of a hand could indicate a hidden agenda, a weakness, or an opportunity. This attentiveness allowed him to act preemptively, addressing threats before they materialized and exploiting opportunities before rivals could respond. His reputation for awareness and foresight became a critical tool. Men quickly realized that deception was costly, and loyalty was both expected and observed. Rival families often underestimated him, drawn to leaders who relied on visibility and intimidation. Lucchese's strength, however, lay in his restraint and patience. He carefully managed disputes, leveraging negotiation, alliances, and subtle demonstrations of power rather than open violence. When confrontation was unavoidable, his actions were decisive, precise, and strategically calculated, sending messages that reinforced authority without creating chaos. Over time, this approach allowed him to consolidate influence and maintain stability across a volatile criminal landscape, positioning himself as a central figure whose decisions had ripple effects far beyond the immediate circle of his operations. Strategic alliances were another cornerstone of his power. Lucchese understood that the mafia's structure depended on interdependence, and he skillfully balanced cooperation and competition with other families. He cultivated relationships that were mutually beneficial, ensuring that agreements were grounded in both loyalty and practicality. Unlike others who relied on threats or coercion, Lucchese's influence was persuasive. His reputation for intelligence, discretion, and reliability made collaboration more appealing than confrontation. Rivals learned that aligning with him often ensured greater long-term advantage than attempting to challenge his authority. Law enforcement and political connections further extended his reach. Lucchese treated these relationships as strategic instruments, not simply shields against prosecution. Through discreet influence, information sharing, and carefully timed favors, he created a protective network that allowed him to anticipate investigations, manipulate outcomes, and operate with minimal interference. These connections, though invisible to the public, were a vital component of his empire, providing both security and leverage in a city where scrutiny and intervention could arise without warning. Violence, while present in his world, remained a carefully measured tool. Lucchese recognized that indiscriminate aggression often brought instability, attention, and retaliation. When necessary, force was applied selectively, targeting threats with precision and purpose. These actions were never impulsive. They were calculated to reinforce loyalty, deter betrayal, and demonstrate authority without inciting broader conflict. By combining restraint with decisiveness, he maintained a balance that few rivals could emulate, establishing a reputation as both intelligent and formidable. Lucchese's personal style reinforced his strategic mastery. He dressed simply, spoke sparingly, and carried himself with an air of quiet authority. His presence in a room was understated, yet commanding. He relied not on spectacle, but on reputation, observation, and careful calculation. Men learned that underestimating him was perilous, as every decision he made reflected foresight, experience, and a meticulous understanding of consequences. This demeanor cultivated respect, minimized unnecessary risk, and reinforced the perception that his control was absolute, even when executed subtly. By this stage, Lucchese's empire had become a complex network of interdependent interests, spanning industries, unions, neighborhoods, and social circles. His influence extended from the back rooms of Manhattan to the shipping docks of Brooklyn, from gambling parlors to political offices. creating a web that was resilient, adaptive, and largely invisible. Every decision, every alliance, and every negotiation was filtered through a mind attuned to strategy, timing, and the subtleties of human behavior. His leadership was defined not by visibility, but by efficacy, the quiet orchestration of events that ensured long-term stability and dominance. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Lucchese's power was his ability to combine patience with decisiveness. He waited, observed, and calculated, ensuring that opportunities were fully understood before acting. Yet when the moment for action arrived, it was executed with precision, leaving rivals with no room for miscalculation. This duality, patience tempered by decisive action, allowed him to maintain control in a volatile environment, turning potential threats into advantages and consolidating power in ways that were as subtle as they were effective. By the end of this period, Tommy Lucchese had solidified his reputation as a master strategist and silent force within New York's criminal landscape. His empire was vast, integrated, and deeply resilient, yet its reach was often invisible to the casual observer. While others relied on aggression or visibility, Lucchese's influence was derived from intelligence, patience, and careful orchestration. The networks he built, the alliances he maintained, and the strategies he executed ensured that his family remained dominant, profitable, and respected, a legacy of subtle power and strategic brilliance that would endure for decades. The city never truly slept, though its restlessness often went unnoticed by those who walked its streets in the daylight. New York in the late 1950s was a living organism of ambition, opportunity, and danger, where fortunes were made and lost on subtle maneuvers that rarely attracted attention outside closed rooms. For Tommy Lucchese, the city was a canvas, and every business deal, labor negotiation, and strategic alliance was a stroke in a meticulously planned portrait of influence. His rise had been gradual, deliberate, and silent, a methodical consolidation of power that left no room for error and no need for unnecessary display. Lucchese's approach to power had always been rooted in patience and observation. He understood that true influence was less about fear and more about perception. A man who believed that Lucchese controlled the levers of opportunity and consequence would often act in accordance with that belief, even if the full extent of his power was unseen. This subtle manipulation of perception allowed him to achieve outcomes that brute force alone could never secure. Every decision, every alliance, and every negotiation was calculated to reinforce his image as both omnipresent and untouchable, a strategy that required constant vigilance and insight. At the core of his empire were the labor unions, which provided not only income but strategic leverage. The control of unions in key industries like shipping, garment, and construction allowed Lucchese to influence economic activity across New York. He could sway contracts, control the timing of shipments, and exert pressure on business leaders with a sophistication that few understood. His influence was often invisible. Those outside his circle might see only the results: delayed contracts, accelerated shipments, or compliant leadership, but never the intricate planning that produced them. This quiet dominance reinforced loyalty, created dependency, and secured his position at the apex of organized crime in the city. Lucchese's operations in entertainment and nightlife further extended his reach. Nightclubs, theaters, and private venues were more than sources of revenue. They were arenas of observation and negotiation. He used these spaces to cultivate relationships, assess the ambitions of others, and orchestrate deals without the need for overt displays of power. Influential figures, from business magnates to politicians, were drawn into his orbit, often unaware of the extent to which their decisions aligned with his objectives. In this way, Lucchese's influence became embedded across the social and economic fabric of the city, ensuring that his power extended far beyond the traditional boundaries of the underworld. Despite the scale of his operations, Lucchese remained deeply attuned to the human element. He observed behaviors, speech patterns, and subtle gestures with the acuity of a seasoned strategist. A hesitation, a shift in tone, or an unguarded expression could reveal intentions, weaknesses, or opportunities. This attentiveness allowed him to anticipate threats before they materialized, exploit openings before rivals recognized them, and cultivate loyalty among those whose support was essential. His ability to read men and situations was one of his most formidable tools, ensuring that control was maintained even in moments of unpredictability. Rival families often underestimated Lucchese, mistaking his calm demeanor for passivity. Yet his restraint was deliberate. He understood that impulsive action and visible aggression often invited countermeasures, law enforcement scrutiny, and instability within his own organization. By exercising patience and deploying force selectively, he could maintain authority while avoiding unnecessary risk. Violence, when used, was precise, targeted, and meaningful. A clear demonstration of consequences that reinforced loyalty and deterred betrayal without provoking widespread conflict. Lucchese's strategic alliances were equally critical. He recognized that the mafia's structure depended on both cooperation and competition, and he skillfully navigated these dynamics. He cultivated mutually beneficial relationships with rival families, ensuring that agreements were grounded in practicality as well as loyalty. Unlike others who relied on intimidation or coercion, Lucchese's influence was persuasive. Men respected and followed him because doing so was advantageous, necessary, and, increasingly, inevitable. Over time, this careful balancing of interests allowed him to consolidate power, minimize conflicts, and strengthen the stability of his empire. Connections with law enforcement and political figures added another dimension to his influence. Lucchese did not treat these relationships merely as shields. They were instruments of information, leverage, and strategic advantage. Through discreet communication, selective favors, and cultivated loyalty, he gained access to critical intelligence, anticipated investigations, and maintained operational continuity. These connections allowed him to navigate a complex environment with efficiency, ensuring that his influence remained unchallenged even as the pressures of enforcement and regulation intensified. One of Lucchese's greatest strengths was his ability to combine patience with decisiveness. He could wait for the optimal moment to act, observing developments and assessing risks with precision. Yet when action was necessary, it was executed with clarity, speed, and authority. This ability to anticipate, plan, and act created a sense of inevitability around his decisions. Men understood that opposing him was not only risky, but likely futile. The quiet confidence with which he exercised power further reinforced the perception that Lucchese's control was absolute, even when executed behind closed doors. The operations of his organization were tightly coordinated, reflecting his meticulous attention to detail. From union management to gambling enterprises, from legitimate business dealings to clandestine negotiations, Lucchese ensured that every component of his empire served a purpose. Delegation was used effectively, but he remained aware of developments at all levels, intervening when necessary to address threats, capitalize on opportunities, or correct deviations. This combination of oversight and trust created an organization that was disciplined, resilient, and responsive, a network capable of sustaining influence across multiple sectors simultaneously. Lucchese's personal demeanor reinforced his authority. He dressed simply, spoke minimally, and carried himself with an air of quiet confidence. Unlike flamboyant contemporaries who drew attention through ostentation, he relied on reputation, observation, and subtle action. Those who underestimated him often faced swift, precise consequences, reinforcing the idea that his influence was both pervasive and inescapable. His calm, measured approach became a defining characteristic, ensuring that loyalty, respect, and fear coexisted in a delicate but effective balance. By the end of this period, Lucchese had transformed from a rising figure into a central architect of organized crime in New York. His empire was expansive, integrated, and resilient, spanning industries, unions, social networks, and the underworld itself. Decisions made in private offices or discreet meetings shaped outcomes across the city, yet the full extent of his control remained invisible to outsiders. His leadership was defined not by visibility or spectacle, but by effectiveness, the quiet orchestration of events, the strategic deployment of influence, and the meticulous management of both people and resources. Ultimately, Tommy Lucchese's story during this era was one of subtle mastery. He demonstrated that true power is exercised not through loud displays or reckless action, but through calculated patience, strategic alliances, and the careful manipulation of perception. In the complex, ever-shifting landscape of New York's criminal underworld, Lucchese's influence was silent but absolute, guiding outcomes, shaping behavior, and consolidating authority in ways that would define the trajectory of the Lucchese family for decades. His empire, built in shadows and maintained through intelligence, patience, and strategic foresight, was a testament to the enduring power of subtlety and the quiet force of a mind attuned to every nuance of its environment. The city's skyline glimmered under a winter night sky, lights reflecting in the cold waters of the harbor, each building a monument to ambition, commerce, and human striving. Beneath this facade of civility and routine, another world thrived, a network of influence, negotiation, and power that few ever glimpsed. Tommy Lucchese moved through this realm with a precision and patience that set him apart from virtually every other figure in the city's criminal underworld. By the late 1952, he had cultivated an empire that extended across industries, neighborhoods, unions, and clandestine operations. Yet his presence was felt more than it was seen, an invisible force shaping events without the need for spectacle. Lucchese's rise had been neither sudden nor violent. It was the product of years of careful observation, strategic relationships, and calculated risks. Unlike other mobsters who relied on visibility, intimidation, or impulsive action, he wielded influence through subtlety, foresight, and the manipulation of circumstances to ensure outcomes aligned with his interests. Every alliance was considered, every negotiation evaluated, every transaction analyzed for potential leverage. This methodical approach allowed him to operate in a world defined by volatility while maintaining control, stability, and a level of discretion that few could emulate. Central to his power was the mastery of labor unions, a domain in which he exerted influence quietly but decisively. By controlling key unions in shipping, construction, and garment industries, Lucchese could dictate the flow of business, sway contracts, and assert pressure on both legitimate and illicit enterprises. His approach was subtle. He employed trusted lieutenants to oversee day-to-day operations while maintaining a comprehensive understanding of developments. Loyalty was enforced through a combination of incentive and consequence, ensuring that those who operated under his authority remained reliable and aligned with his strategic objectives. Even the smallest deviation from expectations was monitored, evaluated, and addressed with precision. Entertainment and nightlife were equally vital components of Lucchese's reach. Nightclubs, theaters, and private venues provided both income and strategic opportunity. They were arenas in which he could observe potential allies or rivals, negotiate arrangements, and solidify his influence over social and business networks. Each encounter was deliberate, calculated to reinforce his position without attracting undue attention. Political figures, business leaders, and influential socialites were drawn into these spaces, often unaware of the extent to which their decisions were being subtly guided. Through these channels, Lucchese extended his empire beyond the immediate sphere of crime, integrating it into the broader fabric of city life. Human observation remained at the heart of his strategy. Lucchese's ability to read gestures, tone, and subtle behavioral cues was unmatched. He could discern hesitation, ambition, fear, or deception with remarkable accuracy, using these insights to anticipate actions and influence outcomes. This attentiveness allowed him to stay ahead of rivals, neutralize threats before they became critical, and cultivate loyalty among those whose support was essential. Over time, his reputation for insight and foresight became one of his most effective tools, discouraging deceit and ensuring that his influence was reinforced by both respect and apprehension. Rival families often misjudged him, equating his calm and understated demeanor with passivity. Yet this restraint was strategic, not a sign of weakness. Lucchese understood that visible aggression often provoked retaliation, scrutiny, or instability within his own ranks. By exercising patience, leveraging alliances, and deploying force selectively, he maintained authority while minimizing risk. Violence, when employed, was precise and purposeful, signaling consequences and reinforcing loyalty without generating chaos. This balance of restraint and action made him a formidable figure, one whose power was enduring and whose influence extended far beyond the immediate reach of his operations. Strategic alliances were another cornerstone of his authority. Lucchese navigated the delicate balance of cooperation and competition between the five families with skill. He forged agreements grounded in practical benefit as well as loyalty, ensuring that collaboration with him was both advantageous and strategically sound. Men recognized that defying Lucchese, or attempting to outmaneuver him, often invited failure, while aligning with him provided stability, opportunity, and long-term advantage. These alliances, carefully nurtured and maintained, allowed him to consolidate power and reduce the likelihood of conflict, creating an ecosystem in which his influence was both pervasive and resilient. Lucchese's connections with law enforcement and political figures further enhanced his strategic position. These relationships were not merely defensive shields, they were instruments of intelligence and influence. Through discreet communication, cultivated loyalty, and selective favors, he gained access to critical information, anticipated investigations, and ensured operational continuity. By integrating these networks into his broader strategy, he maintained a level of control that few rivals could challenge, reinforcing the perception that he was untouchable and omnipresent even when physically absent from a location. Patience was the key to Lucchese's strategy. He observed, analyzed, and waited for optimal opportunities to act. Yet when decisive action was required, he moved with clarity, precision, and authority. This combination of anticipation and decisiveness created a sense of inevitability around his decisions. Those who challenged him often found themselves outmaneuvered, not by brute force, but by foresight, preparation, and an understanding of human behavior that allowed him to shape events subtly yet irreversibly. His reputation for strategic brilliance became a tool in itself, deterring challenges and reinforcing loyalty without the need for overt threats. Lucchese's empire was a finely tuned network, spanning labor unions, entertainment venues, legitimate businesses, and illicit enterprises. Every sector was coordinated, ensuring that influence flowed seamlessly across operations. Delegation was balanced with oversight. Trusted lieutenants managed day-to-day affairs, while Lucchese remained informed and ready to intervene when strategic interests required. This combination of distributed authority and centralized awareness allowed the organization to remain adaptive, resilient, and highly responsive to threats and opportunities alike. Even in personal interactions, Lucchese's presence reinforced authority. He dressed simply, spoke with measured intent, and maintained an air of quiet confidence. Unlike flamboyant figures who drew attention through ostentation, his reputation, calm demeanor, and meticulous planning created a commanding presence without spectacle. Men learned quickly that underestimating him was perilous, and that loyalty and competence were rewarded while disloyalty or misjudgment carried consequences measured, precise, and unavoidable. By the close of this period, Lucchese had solidified his role as the silent architect of New York's criminal landscape. His empire, built on strategy, patience, and meticulous attention to human and structural dynamics, was both vast and resilient. He had mastered the interplay between visible and invisible influence, between legitimate business and clandestine operations, between patience and decisive action. The city's underworld and beyond were shaped by his choices, yet the full extent of his power remained largely invisible to the untrained eye. Tommy Lucchese's story during this era was a testament to subtle mastery. He demonstrated that true influence is exercised not through spectacle or impulsive aggression, but through foresight, strategic patience, and the careful orchestration of events and people. His empire was a reflection of intelligence applied methodically, of relationships leveraged thoughtfully, and of power wielded quietly but decisively. In the shadowed corridors of the city, in the back rooms of nightclubs and offices, Lucchese's presence was felt in every decision, shaping the trajectory of organized crime and cementing a legacy that would endure for decades. The city seemed alive in ways most could never perceive. Beneath the towering skyscrapers, the busy streets, and the ceaseless flow of commerce, another current of power and influence surged quietly, shaping outcomes in ways visible only to those attuned to its rhythm. Tommy Lucchese had learned to move within this hidden network like a master conductor, orchestrating events with precision, patience, and foresight. By the late 1952, he had established an empire that spanned labor unions, entertainment, legitimate business, and clandestine enterprises, yet his presence was rarely overt. He was a figure whose influence was understood through results rather than visibility. A silent force whose decisions reverberated through the underworld and beyond. Lucchese's strategic brilliance was evident in every facet of his operations. Unlike other figures who relied on aggression or notoriety to assert dominance, he relied on calculated subtlety, cultivating influence through foresight and manipulation. Each alliance was considered, each negotiation meticulously planned, and each decision assessed for long-term impact. He understood that in a world governed by loyalty, fear, and perception, Even small miscalculations could lead to chaos. Consequently, Lucchese treated every detail as consequential, ensuring that his empire operated with a level of cohesion and efficiency unmatched by contemporaries. Central to his strategy was control over labor unions. By guiding the operations of unions connected to shipping, construction, and garment industries, Lucchese wielded influence that extended into the financial and operational decisions of legitimate businesses. He could sway contracts, determine the pace of shipments, and subtly influence corporate behavior, all without overt displays of power. This quiet control reinforced dependency, loyalty, and his reputation as an operator who could achieve results without drawing unnecessary attention. Men who attempted to subvert or deceive him quickly discovered that his observation and anticipation were unparalleled, and the consequences of misjudgment were swift and unavoidable. Entertainment and nightlife were extensions of his strategic reach. Nightclubs, theaters, and private establishments were not just sources of revenue, they were instruments through which Lucchese assessed ambitions, forged alliances, and executed negotiations. These spaces allowed him to interact with influential figures outside the traditional criminal sphere, from business leaders to politicians, subtly guiding their decisions and integrating them into his broader network. Every meeting, every exchange, and every arrangement was purposeful, designed to consolidate influence while maintaining discretion. The outcomes of these interactions often went unnoticed, yet they further solidified his position at the nexus of power in the city. Lucchese's mastery of human behavior was a cornerstone of his influence. He studied mannerisms, tone, hesitation, and subtle gestures, understanding that these cues often revealed more than words alone. This attentiveness allowed him to anticipate challenges, identify opportunities, and maintain control over operations in ways that appeared effortless to outsiders. His ability to assess intentions and motivations ensured that loyalty was rewarded, while miscalculations or betrayals were met with targeted, precise consequences. Over time, this skill became one of his most formidable tools, allowing him to maintain dominance without overt displays of force. Rival families often underestimated him, drawn to leaders who relied on intimidation or spectacle. Lucchese's calm demeanor and understated authority were mistaken for passivity, yet his restraint was strategic. He knew that unnecessary aggression could provoke retaliation, attract law enforcement scrutiny, and destabilize his own operations. By exercising patience, leveraging alliances, and deploying force judiciously, he maintained authority while minimizing risk. Violence, when employed, was deliberate, targeted, and meaningful, sending a clear message while preserving stability. This strategic use of power allowed him to assert dominance without exposing himself to unnecessary danger. Alliances with other families were central to his success. Lucchese navigated the delicate balance of cooperation and rivalry with exceptional skill, creating agreements grounded in practicality, mutual benefit, and loyalty. He demonstrated that influence could be persuasive rather than coercive. Aligning with him offered long-term advantages, while defiance often led to miscalculated outcomes. Through these alliances, he consolidated control, minimized conflict, and reinforced the perception that his reach was comprehensive and inevitable. Even those outside his immediate sphere recognized the wisdom of collaboration, often choosing alignment over confrontation. Connections with law enforcement and political figures further enhanced his operational stability. These relationships, carefully cultivated, provided intelligence, influence, and security. Lucchese did not simply bribe officials or seek protection. He integrated these contacts into his broader strategy, creating channels through which critical information could flow, investigations anticipated, and operations maintained with minimal disruption. These networks allowed him to operate in ways that appeared legitimate, while preserving the effectiveness and reach of his empire. His foresight in these matters added a layer of resilience that few rivals could replicate. Patience and timing remained central to Lucchese's approach. He observed events, assessed risks, and awaited the optimal moment to act. Yet when action was required, it was executed decisively and with precision, leaving rivals little opportunity to counteract. This blend of anticipation and strategic deployment created an aura of inevitability, reinforcing his reputation as a master strategist. Men understood that opposing him was not simply dangerous, it was likely futile. His ability to influence outcomes subtly yet irreversibly became a defining characteristic of his leadership. The coordination of his operations was meticulous. From union management to gambling, entertainment, and legitimate business, each element of his empire was aligned with overarching strategic objectives. Delegation allowed day-to-day activities to proceed efficiently, while Lucchese maintained comprehensive oversight, ready to intervene when necessary. This balance between autonomy and supervision ensured that his organization was adaptable, resilient, and responsive, capable of navigating unforeseen challenges without compromising long-term objectives. Lucchese's presence, though understated, reinforced his authority. He dressed modestly, spoke minimally, and exuded quiet confidence. Unlike flamboyant contemporaries who drew attention through ostentation or aggression, his influence stemmed from perception, reputation, and the subtle orchestration of events. Those who underestimated him quickly discovered that his strategic patience, foresight, and decisiveness left little room for error. Loyalty was rewarded, while miscalculations or attempts to deceive were met with consequences carefully calibrated to ensure lessons were learned without creating instability. By the close of this period, Tommy Lucchese had solidified his role as the unseen architect of New York's criminal landscape. His empire, built on intelligence, foresight, and meticulous management, was expansive, resilient, and deeply integrated into the fabric of the city. Decisions made in discreet meetings and back rooms shaped labor agreements, business operations, and criminal alliances alike, yet the full scope of his influence remained largely invisible to outsiders. His leadership demonstrated that power, when exercised through strategy, patience, and observation, could achieve outcomes far beyond the reach of brute force or ostentation. Tommy Lucchese's story in this era is a testament to the enduring power of subtle mastery. He proved that influence is most effective when exercised with precision, discretion, and strategic foresight. By aligning human behavior, structural opportunity, and careful timing, he created an empire that was resilient, adaptive, and quietly omnipresent. In the hidden corridors of New York City, in offices, nightclubs, and union halls, Lucchese's decisions shaped outcomes, directed loyalty, and solidified his legacy as one of the most formidable figures in organized crime history. His silent power endured, a testament to intelligence, strategy, and the careful orchestration of influence. New York in the late 1950s was a city of dual realities. By day, its streets hummed with commerce, industry, and the ordinary rhythm of daily life. By night, a shadowed network of influence, negotiation, and silent power operated beneath the surface, shaping events in ways invisible to the untrained eye. Tommy Lucchese had long mastered this hidden world. He moved through it like a tactician in a game, where every gesture, conversation, and decision carried weight, understanding that true control required patience, observation, and a calculated approach that balanced subtlety with decisive action. Lucchese's empire had grown far beyond the confines of his immediate family or the traditional territories of organized crime. Labor unions in the shipping, construction, and garment industries were instruments of influence, allowing him to shape contracts, manipulate workflows, and exert pressure on businesses without overt confrontation. These unions were not merely sources of profit, they were strategic levers embedded in the city's economic machinery, providing Lucchese with a level of control that few could rival. His influence was often invisible. Those outside his inner circle saw only results, unaware of the careful orchestration and foresight that produced them. His operations in entertainment and nightlife complemented this influence. Nightclubs, theaters, and private establishments were venues for negotiation, observation, and alliance building. Lucchese understood that power extended beyond direct control. It was as much about perception, influence, and relationships. Political figures, business leaders, and influential socialites were drawn into his orbit, often unknowingly aligned with his objectives through carefully cultivated interactions. These spaces allowed him to integrate multiple spheres of influence into a cohesive strategy, blending legitimate business, social leverage, and clandestine operations into a singularly effective network. Lucchese's understanding of human behavior was central to his strategy. He observed nuances, gestures, tone, hesitation, and body language with remarkable acuity. A flicker of hesitation, a shift in posture, or a carefully chosen word could reveal intent, weakness, or opportunity. These observations informed his decision-making, allowing him to anticipate challenges, neutralize threats, and cultivate loyalty with precision. His reputation for foresight and perception became a formidable tool, deterring deception and ensuring that allegiance to him was both rational and advantageous. Rival families often misjudged him, interpreting his calm demeanor as indecision or weakness. Yet Lucchese's restraint was deliberate. He knew that aggressive, impulsive action often drew retaliation, legal scrutiny, or instability within his own operations. Patience, negotiation, and selective use of force allowed him to maintain authority while minimizing risk. When violence was necessary, it was precise and targeted, delivering clear consequences while preserving stability. This approach established him as a formidable strategist, respected and feared not for spectacle but for the quiet certainty of his influence. Alliances with other families were carefully cultivated. Lucchese recognized the necessity of balance between competition and cooperation. Agreements were grounded in practicality, mutual benefit, and a recognition of his strategic foresight. Aligning with him offered long-term advantages, while defiance often led to miscalculation and failure. Through these relationships, he consolidated power, minimized the likelihood of conflict, and reinforced the perception that his reach was extensive and virtually inescapable. Even those who operated outside his immediate network understood that collaboration with Lucchese was often the wisest course of action. His connections with law enforcement and political figures further reinforced his position. Lucchese viewed these relationships as strategic instruments rather than mere shields. Through discreet influence, cultivated loyalty, and selective favors, he gained intelligence, anticipated investigations, and maintained operational continuity. These networks enhanced his ability to navigate the city's complex environment, providing both protection and leverage. By integrating these connections into his broader strategy, he ensured that his influence extended across both visible and hidden layers of authority. Patience and timing were hallmarks of his approach. Lucchese observed developments, assessed risks, and waited for the optimal moment to act. When action was required, it was executed decisively and with precision, leaving rivals little room for counteraction. This combination of anticipation and strategic deployment created a sense of inevitability around his decisions. Men who considered challenging him soon realized that his foresight and planning left them outmaneuvered before any confrontation could occur. Loyalty, once earned, was maintained. Betrayal was met with consequences carefully calculated to reinforce authority and deterrence. The structure of his operations reflected meticulous organization. From union oversight to gambling, entertainment, and legitimate business ventures, each component was aligned with broader strategic objectives. Delegation allowed trusted lieutenants to manage daily operations, while Lucchese maintained a comprehensive understanding of developments, prepared to intervene when necessary. This balance of autonomy and supervision ensured adaptability, resilience, and the capacity to respond to challenges without compromising long-term goals. The result was an organization capable of operating across multiple sectors simultaneously, seamlessly integrating both legitimate and illicit spheres of influence. Lucchese's personal style reinforced his authority. He dressed modestly, spoke minimally, and projected calm confidence. Unlike more flamboyant contemporaries, he relied not on appearance or public notoriety, but on perception, reputation, and subtle action. Men who underestimated him often faced swift, decisive consequences, reinforcing the idea that loyalty and competence were rewarded while misjudgment or deception carried cost. His calm presence, quiet intelligence, and methodical approach created a commanding aura without spectacle, enhancing his influence and ensuring enduring control. By the close of this period, Lucchese had transformed into the central figure in New York's hidden network of power. His empire, labor unions, business ventures, entertainment, and clandestine operations was extensive, resilient, and tightly coordinated. Decisions made in private offices or quiet meetings shaped labor agreements, business practices, and the underworld's dynamics. Yet the full extent of his influence remained largely invisible to the casual observer. His leadership was defined by efficacy rather than visibility. His quiet orchestration ensured stability, loyalty, and the enduring reach of his authority. Tommy Lucchese's story during this era demonstrates the power of strategic mastery. Influence, when exercised with intelligence, patience, and careful orchestration, can achieve outcomes that force, spectacle, or intimidation cannot. Through the subtle alignment of human behavior, structural opportunity, and timing, Lucchese built an empire that endured, adaptive and resilient, quietly shaping New York's criminal landscape. In offices, union halls, and private clubs, his decisions set in motion a network of loyalty, control, and opportunity that would define the Lucchese family for decades. His legacy was not measured by the noise of his actions, but by the depth, precision, and inevitability of his influence. The city had a rhythm of its own, a pulse that only the most attuned could feel. Beneath the clamor of streetcars, the shouts of laborers, and the hum of commerce, New York thrummed with a hidden current, a flow of power, influence, and negotiation that dictated much of the city's unseen order. Tommy Lucchese had long learned to move in harmony with this rhythm, understanding that dominance was less about force and more about foresight, subtlety, and control over the levers that moved men and money alike. By the late 1952, he had established an empire that reached across industries, social circles, and the clandestine underworld, but his presence was seldom overt. Lucchese was the silent architect of influence, a figure whose authority was measured through results, not spectacle. Lucchese's mastery lay in his ability to align opportunity with execution. Labor unions, particularly those controlling the shipping, construction, and garment industries, were not merely sources of income, they were instruments through which he shaped the city's economic and political landscape. By exerting influence over contracts, business decisions, and the flow of goods, he could exert pressure, create advantages, and maintain authority without drawing attention. The effects of his strategy were visible in the outcomes, yet the intricate orchestration remained largely unseen. Those who underestimated him often discovered too late that his reach extended further than they imagined. Entertainment and nightlife formed another critical layer of his influence. Nightclubs, theaters, and private establishments were more than revenue streams. They were venues for assessment, negotiation, and strategic alliance building. Lucchese understood that the subtle shaping of perception could be as powerful as overt control. By engaging influential figures, politicians, business leaders, and socialites in these arenas, he extended his network beyond the conventional sphere of organized crime. Every meeting, every conversation, and every arrangement served a dual purpose, consolidating influence while preserving discretion. In these spaces, power was exercised quietly, yet decisively, often altering outcomes without any public acknowledgement. Observation remained central to Lucchese's strategy. He watched for nuances in behavior, tone, and body language, understanding that subtle cues often revealed intent, opportunity, or vulnerability. This attentiveness allowed him to anticipate threats, manipulate outcomes, and cultivate loyalty with remarkable precision. Men who dealt with Lucchese learned quickly that deception was costly and that loyalty carried tangible benefits. His reputation for insight became a protective and persuasive tool, ensuring that allegiance was rational, strategic, and reinforced by the inevitability of consequences. Rival families frequently misread him, mistaking his quiet, calculated demeanor for passivity. In reality, Lucchese's restraint was a deliberate strategy, a recognition that visible aggression often invited retaliation, law enforcement attention, and internal instability. Patience, diplomacy, and selective use of force allowed him to assert authority without exposing his operations to unnecessary risk. Violence, when necessary, was precise and meaningful, designed to convey authority, deter betrayal, and reinforce loyalty while preserving overall organizational stability. This balance of measured action and strategic restraint marked him as a unique and formidable figure in the criminal hierarchy. Strategic alliances were carefully cultivated across the five families and beyond. Lucchese recognized the importance of balancing competition with cooperation, creating arrangements grounded in mutual benefit and long-term advantage. He demonstrated that influence could be more effective when persuasive rather than coercive, offering opportunity to those aligned with him, while making opposition seem irrational. Over time, these alliances allowed him to consolidate control, reduce the likelihood of conflict, and cultivate a network that extended both his reach and his resilience. Even those outside his immediate sphere understood that collaboration often yielded greater advantage than confrontation. Law enforcement and political connections played a critical role in his operations. Lucchese treated these relationships as strategic instruments rather than mere shields. By cultivating loyalty, providing selective favors, and maintaining discreet channels of communication, he gained early intelligence on investigations, anticipated legal threats, and ensured continuity of operations. These networks allowed him to operate in ways that appeared legitimate to the public, while preserving the effectiveness and reach of his empire. His foresight in integrating these relationships into his overall strategy added a layer of resilience and control that few rivals could replicate. Timing and patience were hallmarks of Lucchese's operational philosophy. He observed developments, assessed risks, and waited for the moment when action would yield maximum advantage. When that moment arrived, his decisions were executed with clarity, precision, and authority. This combination of foresight and decisive action created a sense of inevitability around his operations. Rivals and associates alike recognized that challenging him was not only dangerous, but likely futile. Lucchese's ability to align opportunity with execution reinforced his influence, while deterring disloyalty or miscalculation. The structure of his empire reflected meticulous organization. Each component, from labor oversight to gambling, entertainment, and legitimate business ventures, was aligned with overarching strategic objectives. Delegation empowered trusted lieutenants to manage day-to-day operations, while Lucchese maintained comprehensive oversight, ready to intervene whenever strategic alignment required. This balance of autonomy and supervision created an organization that was disciplined, adaptable, and resilient, capable of responding to challenges without compromising long-term goals or stability. Lucchese's personal presence further reinforced his authority. Modest attire, measured speech, and calm confidence projected an image of control without the need for flamboyance. Unlike contemporaries who relied on visibility and intimidation, his influence was rooted in perception, reputation, and strategic mastery. Underestimating him was perilous. Loyalty was rewarded, and disloyalty met with consequences carefully calculated to instruct, deter, and reinforce his control. His quiet confidence communicated authority in a way that few could challenge, ensuring that his empire operated effectively with minimal overt enforcement. By the end of this period, Lucchese's influence had become deeply embedded in the fabric of the city. His empire, spanning labor unions, entertainment venues, legitimate business, and clandestine operations, was cohesive, resilient, and adaptive. Decisions made in private meetings, offices, and back rooms had far-reaching consequences, shaping labor agreements, business decisions, and the dynamics of organized crime itself. Yet the full extent of his power remained largely invisible to outsiders, a testament to the effectiveness of subtle, strategic influence. Tommy Lucchese's story in this era illustrates the enduring power of strategic patience, observation, and subtle mastery. Influence, when exercised with intelligence and foresight, can achieve outcomes that spectacle, force, or intimidation cannot. By aligning human behavior, structural opportunities, and precise timing, he built an empire that endured and adapted, quietly shaping New York's criminal landscape. In the shadowed halls of power, in offices, union halls, and private establishments, his decisions directed loyalty, controlled outcomes, and secured a legacy of silent yet absolute authority. Lucchese's power was measured not in noise or notoriety, but in results, precision, and the inevitability of his influence. The streets of New York were a study in contrasts. By day, the city bustled with commerce, pedestrians, and the noise of industry. By night, a subtler, more potent rhythm governed its movements, a rhythm of influence, negotiation, and silent power that shaped the lives of countless men and women, often without their awareness. Tommy Lucchese had long understood this hidden current, moving within it with a precision, patience, and strategic foresight that few could rival. His empire extended beyond the visible reach of law enforcement, rival families, and even the public, creating a network of influence that was as effective as it was invisible. Lucchese's authority was not maintained through spectacle but through the careful orchestration of events and people. He understood that control in the underworld and in the city's intersecting legitimate sectors depended as much on perception as on reality. If men believed that Lucchese's influence extended into every corner of opportunity, they would often act in accordance with that belief, even without direct oversight. This manipulation of perception allowed him to achieve outcomes that brute force or intimidation alone could not, turning loyalty, obedience, and fear into instruments of strategic advantage. Labor unions remained a central pillar of his operations. Through unions in shipping, construction, and the garment industry, Lucchese could exert influence over contracts, determine the flow of goods, and guide decisions in ways that ensured both profit and authority. These operations required meticulous planning and trusted lieutenants capable of implementing his directives while providing him with accurate information. Even minor deviations from expectations were addressed immediately, reinforcing the idea that Lucchese's control extended to every level of the organization. His ability to integrate labor operations into broader strategic objectives was unmatched, making unions not merely a revenue source, but a critical lever of power. The entertainment sector provided another arena for strategic influence. Nightclubs, theaters, and private venues were carefully selected and managed to serve dual purposes: income generation and network cultivation. Lucchese recognized that power extended beyond direct control. It was reinforced by perception, alliance, and social leverage. These venues became spaces where influential politicians, business leaders, and cultural figures could be observed, assessed, and subtly guided toward decisions beneficial to him. By integrating these interactions into his broader network, he extended influence beyond traditional criminal domains, blurring the lines between legitimate and illicit authority in a way that few rivals could comprehend. Lucchese's ability to read human behavior was legendary. He noticed the subtlest cues, changes in posture, hesitation in speech, and micro-expressions that often revealed intention, ambition, or fear. These observations allowed him to anticipate challenges, exploit opportunities, and cultivate loyalty with precision. Individuals under his influence quickly learned that attempts at deception or betrayal were not only unwise but nearly impossible to conceal. His skill in interpreting human behavior functioned as both shield and sword, deterring misconduct while providing him with strategic insight. Rival families often misjudged him, interpreting his calm demeanor as passivity. Yet his restraint was deliberate, a tactical choice rooted in strategic patience. He understood that impulsive aggression often provoked retaliation, attracted law enforcement scrutiny, and destabilized internal operations. By exercising patience, leveraging alliances, and using violence selectively, Lucchese maintained authority while minimizing risk. When decisive action was required, it was precise, targeted, and consequential, reinforcing both loyalty and deterrence without provoking unnecessary instability. This balance of patience and decisiveness marked him as a unique force in the criminal landscape. Alliances with other families were essential to his enduring dominance. Lucchese recognized that organized crime was not merely a matter of territorial control but of mutually beneficial collaboration. Agreements were negotiated with an eye toward practicality and long-term gain, offering partners advantages that encouraged compliance and discouraged opposition. His reputation for strategic foresight made alignment with him rational and desirable, while defiance was increasingly seen as folly. Through these alliances, Lucchese was able to consolidate power, reduce conflicts, and cultivate a network that was both extensive and resilient, creating a foundation for his influence that spanned multiple sectors and generations. Connections with law enforcement and political figures enhanced the stability of his operations. Lucchese treated these relationships as tools, rather than mere protections, using them to gain intelligence, anticipate investigations, and maintain operational continuity. By integrating these networks into his overall strategy, he ensured that his influence extended across both public and private spheres, reinforcing his reputation as untouchable and omnipresent. This foresight allowed him to operate with an efficiency and discretion that few rivals could match, turning potential obstacles into predictable variables within his strategic plan. Timing was a defining aspect of his methodology. Lucchese observed developments carefully, analyzing risks and opportunities before taking action. When he chose to intervene, the impact was decisive, precise, and unavoidable. This approach created a sense of inevitability surrounding his decisions, making opposition both risky and likely futile. The combination of anticipation and execution reinforced his reputation as a master strategist, and loyalty became not only beneficial but rational for those who wished to thrive within his sphere of influence. The structure of Lucchese's empire reflected an extraordinary degree of organization. Every component, labor, oversight, entertainment operations, gambling, and legitimate business, was aligned with overarching strategic objectives. Delegation empowered trusted lieutenants to manage day-to-day tasks, yet Lucchese maintained oversight and the capacity to intervene whenever necessary. His balance of autonomy and supervision created an organization that was disciplined, resilient, and adaptive, capable of responding to challenges without compromising long-term goals. His meticulous approach ensured both operational efficiency and strategic flexibility, allowing the empire to expand while remaining tightly controlled. Lucchese's personal presence reinforced his authority. Simple attire, measured speech, and calm confidence projected an aura of control without the need for ostentation. Unlike more flamboyant contemporaries, who relied on visibility or intimidation, Lucchese's influence emanated from perception, reputation, and strategic mastery. Men who underestimated him quickly learned the cost of miscalculation. Loyalty was rewarded, and missteps were met with consequences that were instructive, precise, and enduring. His quiet confidence communicated power effectively, ensuring that both allies and rivals recognized the scope of his reach. By the end of this period, Lucchese had firmly cemented his role as the silent architect of New York's criminal landscape. His empire, spanning labor unions, business ventures, entertainment, and clandestine operations, was cohesive, resilient, and deeply integrated into the city's economic and social structure. Decisions made in private meetings, offices, and nightclubs reverberated across labor agreements, corporate strategies, and the underworld, yet the full extent of his influence remained largely invisible to outsiders. His leadership was measured in results, effectiveness, and strategic foresight rather than spectacle, a testament to the enduring power of subtle mastery. Tommy Lucchese's story during this era illustrates the efficacy of strategic patience, observation, and subtle orchestration. By aligning opportunity with execution, behavior with consequence, and alliances with self-interest, he built an empire that endured and adapted over decades. His influence was silent yet absolute, shaping outcomes, guiding loyalty, and solidifying his legacy as one of the most formidable and intelligent figures in organized crime history. Lucchese demonstrated that true power lies not in visibility or aggression, but in precision, foresight, and the calculated orchestration of human behavior and opportunity. New York's streets never truly slept, and neither did its currents of power. Even as the city slumbered under a veil of fog and neon, an invisible network of influence pulsed beneath the surface, shaping outcomes in ways most citizens could never imagine. Tommy Lucchese had long learned to move within this world with a precision and patience that marked him as exceptional. By the late 1952, he had solidified an empire that extended from labor unions to entertainment, legitimate business, and clandestine operations, yet his presence remained largely unseen. Lucchese was a strategist, an architect of power whose influence was measured not by spectacle but by results. Lucchese's rise had been deliberate, grounded in careful observation and methodical planning. He understood that influence was not merely about commanding obedience, but about shaping perceptions, aligning incentives, and orchestrating outcomes. If those around him believed his reach was pervasive, they would act accordingly, often without direct instruction. This quiet manipulation of perception allowed him to achieve results that brute force could never accomplish. His authority was subtle, invisible to those untrained in the nuances of power, yet absolute in effect. Labor unions were among his most potent instruments of influence. Through unions tied to shipping, construction, and the garment industries, Lucchese could sway contracts, control the timing of shipments, and pressure businesses in ways that reinforced his authority. This influence extended beyond profit. It was a mechanism of control, shaping decisions across the city's economic landscape. Each operation required careful management, delegated to trusted lieutenants who ensured that directives were executed with precision. Minor deviations were addressed swiftly, demonstrating that Lucchese's reach extended to every level of his organization. Entertainment venues offered a different, equally powerful avenue of influence. Nightclubs, theaters, and private establishments were carefully selected and managed to generate revenue and serve as stages for observation, negotiation, and alliance building. Lucchese understood that power was reinforced through perception and relationships. By engaging influential political figures, business leaders, and socialites, he expanded his network beyond traditional criminal spheres. These spaces allowed him to integrate multiple dimensions of influence, blending social, economic, and clandestine operations into a cohesive strategy that few rivals could match. Observation remained central to his strategy. Lucchese noted even the subtlest cues, tone, posture, hesitation, or fleeting expressions that revealed intention or vulnerability. These insights allowed him to anticipate challenges, exploit opportunities, and cultivate loyalty with precision. Men quickly learned that deception was not only dangerous but often futile in his presence. His skill in reading human behavior became both a defensive mechanism and a strategic advantage, reinforcing the inevitability of his influence and deterring betrayal. Rival families often misjudged Lucchese, interpreting his calm, measured demeanor as weakness. In reality, his restraint was deliberate. He recognized that impulsive aggression often provoked retaliation, legal scrutiny, and instability within his own organization. Patience, diplomacy, and selective force allowed him to maintain authority while minimizing risk. When necessary, his actions were precise, targeted, and impactful, sending clear messages without unnecessary chaos. This balance of patience and decisive intervention distinguished him as a master strategist in an environment defined by volatility and unpredictability. Strategic alliances were vital to his enduring dominance. Lucchese understood the complex interplay of cooperation and competition among New York's families. Agreements were negotiated with care, grounded in mutual benefit and reinforced by the perception of his foresight. Aligning with him offered long-term advantages, while opposition often proved costly. Over time, these alliances allowed him to consolidate power, reduce conflict, and cultivate a network of influence that extended far beyond his immediate domain. Even those outside his organization recognized the wisdom of collaboration, understanding that alignment with Lucchese was both rational and necessary. Political and law enforcement connections added a further dimension to his control. Lucchese treated these relationships strategically, integrating them into his broader operations. By maintaining channels of information, providing selective favors, and cultivating loyalty, he gained early intelligence on potential investigations, mitigated legal threats, and ensured continuity in his operations. These networks enhanced his ability to operate effectively and discreetly, providing leverage that reinforced the perception of his omnipresence. His foresight and strategic integration of these relationships amplified his resilience and influence. Timing remained central to Lucchese's methodology. He observed developments, weighed risks, and waited for optimal moments to act. When intervention was necessary, his actions were executed decisively, leaving rivals with little opportunity to respond. This blend of anticipation and precision reinforced the sense that opposition was futile, loyalty was rational, and outcomes were often predetermined. Lucchese's strategic patience, combined with the ability to act with clarity and force, became the hallmark of his leadership style. The structure of his operations reflected meticulous organization. Each component, unions, entertainment, gambling, and legitimate businesses, was aligned with overarching objectives. Delegation allowed trusted lieutenants to manage day-to-day affairs, while Lucchese maintained oversight and strategic authority. This balance of autonomy and control created an organization that was disciplined, adaptable, and resilient. Challenges were addressed without disruption to long-term goals, allowing the empire to expand while remaining tightly managed. His careful orchestration ensured both operational efficiency and strategic flexibility, a rare combination in an unpredictable environment. Lucchese's personal demeanor reinforced his authority. He dressed modestly, spoke with restraint, and projected calm confidence. Unlike contemporaries who relied on flamboyance or intimidation, his influence emanated from reputation, perception, and the precise orchestration of people and events. Underestimating him carried tangible consequences. Loyalty was rewarded, misjudgment or deception punished with calculated precision. His quiet confidence enhanced the effectiveness of his leadership, ensuring that the empire operated smoothly, with minimal overt enforcement required. By this stage in his career, Lucchese's influence had become deeply entrenched in New York's social, economic, and criminal fabric. His empire was cohesive, resilient, and integrated across multiple domains. Decisions made in private meetings, offices, and nightclubs rippled across labor agreements, corporate strategies, and organized crime dynamics. Yet the full scope of his power remained largely invisible to outsiders. a testament to the effectiveness of subtle, strategic influence. His leadership was defined not by spectacle or aggression, but by intelligence, foresight, and the meticulous orchestration of outcomes. Tommy Lucchese's story during this period highlights the enduring power of subtle mastery. By aligning opportunity with execution, human behavior with consequence, and alliances with strategy, he built an empire that endured, adapted, and quietly dominated New York. His influence was silent, yet absolute, shaping decisions, guiding loyalty, and securing a legacy that would define organized crime for decades. Lucchese demonstrated that true power lies not in visibility, notoriety, or aggression, but in precision, foresight, and the strategic orchestration of influence in every sphere of action. New York City's nights had a rhythm that only a few could truly understand. Beneath the glittering lights, the constant traffic, and the apparent chaos of everyday life, a hidden current of influence and negotiation flowed, dictating outcomes in ways that were invisible to ordinary eyes. Tommy Lucchese had long learned to move within this hidden world with patience, precision, and strategic foresight. By the late 1950s, his empire had grown into a complex network spanning labor unions, entertainment venues, legitimate business ventures, and clandestine operations. Yet his authority was rarely overt. Lucchese's power was silent, measured in results rather than spectacle, and absolute in its reach. Lucchese had mastered the art of indirect control. His understanding of influence went beyond simple authority or intimidation. It involved shaping perceptions, aligning incentives, and orchestrating events to ensure desired outcomes. Men and institutions alike often acted in accordance with his will, sometimes without ever realizing the extent of his involvement. This quiet manipulation of perception became a strategic advantage, allowing Lucchese to assert dominance without creating unnecessary risk. His leadership demonstrated that influence could be far more effective when exercised through subtle orchestration rather than overt force. Labor unions remained a central instrument in his strategic arsenal. Through unions connected to shipping, construction, and garment industries, Lucchese could guide contracts, control labor flows, and exert pressure on businesses and competitors alike. These operations were not just about revenue, they were levers of control, shaping decisions across the city's economic framework. Trusted lieutenants executed daily operations under his guidance, ensuring fidelity to his directives and providing him with real-time intelligence. Even minor deviations were addressed swiftly, reinforcing the perception that Lucchese's oversight reached into every corner of his empire. Entertainment and nightlife were another dimension of his influence. Nightclubs, theaters, and private venues were carefully managed to serve multiple purposes: income generation, observation, and strategic alliance building. Lucchese understood that power extended beyond direct control, and that social influence could shape outcomes as effectively as force. Political figures, business leaders, and cultural influencers were drawn into these venues, subtly aligned with his objectives through carefully curated interactions. These spaces allowed Lucchese to integrate multiple spheres of influence, social, economic, and clandestine, into a cohesive network that few could rival. Observation of human behavior remained one of Lucchese's most powerful tools. He noticed micro-expressions, shifts in tone, and subtle changes in posture that revealed intention, fear, or ambition. This insight allowed him to anticipate challenges, exploit opportunities, and enforce loyalty with precision. Those who attempted deception quickly learned that miscalculation in his presence was costly. Lucchese's ability to read and respond to human behavior served both defensive and offensive purposes, deterring betrayal and reinforcing the inevitability of his strategic outcomes. Rival families often misjudged him, mistaking his calm, measured demeanor for indecision. In truth, his restraint was tactical. Lucchese understood that overt aggression could provoke retaliation, attract law enforcement attention, and destabilize internal operations. Patience, negotiation, and selective use of force allowed him to maintain authority while minimizing risk. When decisive action was necessary, it was executed with precision and finality, sending clear messages without creating unnecessary chaos. This balance of patience and power solidified his reputation as a strategist rather than a mere enforcer. Alliances were carefully cultivated across the five families and beyond. Lucchese understood that organized crime required not just territorial control, but also mutually beneficial collaboration. deals were grounded in practical advantage and reinforced by his reputation for foresight. Aligning with him was rational. Opposing him often proved costly. These alliances allowed him to consolidate power, reduce potential conflicts, and cultivate a network that extended his influence across sectors and generations. Even those outside his immediate circle recognized that collaboration was the safer, more advantageous path. Political and law enforcement connections added another dimension to his authority. Lucchese treated these relationships as strategic assets rather than mere protections. By cultivating loyalty, providing selective favors, and maintaining discreet communication, he gained access to intelligence, anticipated investigations, and ensured operational continuity. These connections amplified his reach, allowing him to operate effectively and discreetly while preserving the appearance of legitimacy. Lucchese's foresight in integrating these networks into his broader strategy enhanced both resilience and operational flexibility. Timing was crucial to his methodology. Lucchese observed developments, calculated risks, and waited for optimal moments to intervene. When action was required, it was decisive, precise, and often irreversible. This combination of anticipation and execution created an aura of inevitability around his decisions. Rivals understood that challenging him was not only dangerous, but likely futile. Loyalty, once earned, was maintained. Betrayal was met with consequences that were calculated to instruct, deter, and reinforce authority. The structure of Lucchese's empire reflected extraordinary organization. Each component, labor, oversight, entertainment, gambling, and legitimate business, was aligned with strategic objectives. Delegation empowered trusted lieutenants to manage day-to-day operations, while Lucchese maintained oversight and control over critical decisions. This balance of autonomy and supervision allowed the organization to operate efficiently, adapt to challenges, and expand without compromising long-term stability. His meticulous planning ensured both operational efficiency and strategic resilience. Lucchese's personal presence reinforced his authority. Simple attire, measured speech, and calm confidence communicated control without ostentation. Unlike more flamboyant contemporaries who relied on intimidation, his influence emanated from reputation, perception, and the precise orchestration of people and events. Men who underestimated him quickly learned the cost of misjudgment. Loyalty was rewarded, while mistakes or disloyalty were met with consequences carefully calibrated to instruct and deter. His quiet confidence ensured the empire operated smoothly, with minimal need for overt enforcement. By this stage, Lucchese's influence had become deeply embedded in New York's economic, social, and criminal fabric. His empire was cohesive, resilient, and coordinated across multiple domains. Decisions made in private offices, nightclubs, and union halls affected labor agreements, business deals, and organized crime dynamics. Yet the full scope of his power remained largely invisible to the public. Lucchese's leadership was defined not by aggression or spectacle but by intelligence, foresight, and meticulous orchestration of outcomes. Tommy Lucchese's story in this era highlights the enduring effectiveness of strategic mastery. By aligning opportunity with execution, behavior with consequence, and alliances with self-interest, he built an empire that endured, adapted, and dominated quietly yet absolutely. His influence was silent, shaping decisions, directing loyalty, and securing a legacy that would define organized crime for decades. Lucchese demonstrated that true power lies not in visibility, notoriety, or force, but in foresight, precision, and the careful orchestration of influence across every sphere of action. The city seemed endless, a maze of avenues, alleys, and hidden corners where power shifted quietly but relentlessly. Tommy Lucchese had long mastered the art of navigating this labyrinth, understanding that true influence was measured not in public displays of force, but in the subtle orchestration of outcomes. By the late 1950s, Lucchese's empire had evolved into a sprawling network encompassing labor unions, entertainment, legitimate business ventures, and clandestine operations. His authority was not overt. It was invisible, like the currents beneath a river's surface, shaping everything without ever announcing itself. Lucchese's strategy relied on a deep understanding of both human nature and structural opportunity. He recognized that control extended beyond direct command, and required the ability to influence perception, align incentives, and orchestrate circumstances. Those within his sphere often acted in accordance with his will, sometimes without realizing they were following it. This quiet manipulation of perception became one of his most powerful tools, allowing him to achieve results that brute force or intimidation could never replicate. Every decision, every movement, and every alliance was calculated to reinforce the inevitability of his influence. Labor unions formed a critical pillar of his strategy. Through unions connected to shipping, construction, and garment industries, Lucchese exercised influence over contracts, workflow, and business decisions. These unions were not just sources of profit, they were levers of control, shaping economic outcomes across the city. Trusted lieutenants carried out daily operations while providing Lucchese with real-time intelligence. Minor deviations or miscalculations were addressed immediately, reinforcing the perception that his oversight extended to every corner of his empire. This level of control ensured stability, loyalty, and adaptability, allowing the network to respond to challenges without compromising strategic objectives. The entertainment sector offered another dimension of power. Nightclubs, theaters, and private venues were not merely sources of revenue, they were arenas for negotiation, observation, and influence. Lucchese recognized that shaping perception and cultivating relationships were as critical as commanding obedience. Politicians, business leaders, and cultural figures moved through these spaces, often unknowingly aligned with his objectives. Through these interactions, he expanded his influence beyond traditional criminal spheres, blending social leverage, economic control, and clandestine operations into a cohesive and effective network. Observation of human behavior remained central to Lucchese's approach. He could detect hesitation, subtle shifts in tone, and fleeting gestures that revealed intention, fear, or ambition. These insights allowed him to anticipate challenges, exploit opportunities, and enforce loyalty with precision. Deception or betrayal was rarely tolerated, and those who miscalculated discovered quickly that Lucchese's foresight left little room for error. His ability to read and respond to human behavior functioned both as a shield and a weapon, deterring misconduct and guiding outcomes without the need for overt confrontation. Rival families often misjudged him, interpreting his measured, calm demeanor as passivity or indecision. In reality, his restraint was a calculated strategy. Lucchese understood that aggressive displays often provoked retaliation, attracted law enforcement scrutiny, and destabilized internal operations. Patience, negotiation, and selective use of force allowed him to maintain authority while minimizing risk. When action was necessary, it was deliberate, precise, and irreversible, sending a clear message to allies and rivals alike. This combination of restraint and decisive action reinforced his reputation as a master strategist rather than a mere enforcer. Alliances were carefully curated across the five families and beyond. Lucchese recognized that organized crime required cooperation as much as competition. Negotiations were conducted with foresight, ensuring mutual benefit and reinforcing his reputation for strategic acumen. Alignment with him offered long-term advantages, while defiance often proved costly. Through these relationships, he consolidated power, reduced potential conflicts, and cultivated a network that extended his reach across multiple sectors. Even those outside his immediate circle understood that collaboration with Lucchese was often the wiser, safer choice. Political and law enforcement connections added another layer of influence. Lucchese treated these relationships as tools to enhance operational stability rather than mere shields. By cultivating loyalty, providing selective favors, and maintaining discreet channels of communication, he gained access to intelligence, anticipated investigations, and ensured continuity in his operations. These networks amplified his effectiveness, allowing him to operate openly and discreetly at once, projecting an image of legitimacy while maintaining a covert command over numerous spheres of activity. His foresight and strategic integration of these relationships reinforced the resilience and scope of his empire. Timing was critical to Lucchese's approach. He observed developments carefully, assessed risks, and waited for moments where intervention would have maximum effect. When he acted, his decisions were swift, decisive, and impactful, leaving rivals with little room to counteract. This combination of anticipation and execution created an aura of inevitability around his operations. Loyalty became rational, opposition was risky, and the outcomes of his maneuvers seemed preordained. Lucchese's strategic patience, combined with the capacity for immediate action when necessary, became a defining feature of his leadership. The structure of his empire reflected meticulous planning. Every component, unions, entertainment, gambling, and legitimate businesses, was aligned with overarching strategic goals. Delegation empowered trusted lieutenants to manage daily operations, while Lucchese retained oversight of critical decisions. This balance of autonomy and supervision created an organization capable of resilience, adaptability, and expansion without losing cohesion. Challenges were managed efficiently, and long-term objectives remained protected, ensuring the empire's continued growth and stability. Lucchese's personal demeanor reinforced his authority. He dressed modestly, spoke with restraint, and projected calm confidence. Unlike other figures who relied on intimidation or visibility, his influence came from reputation, perception, and precise orchestration of people and events. Men who underestimated him quickly learned the cost of error. Loyalty was rewarded, while mistakes or disloyalty were met with calculated, instructive consequences. His quiet, controlled presence ensured operational continuity and reinforced the perception of his unassailable influence. By this stage, Lucchese's empire had become deeply embedded in New York's economic, social, and criminal infrastructure. Decisions made in private offices, nightclubs, and union halls affected labor agreements, corporate strategies, and criminal dynamics. Yet the full extent of his influence remained largely invisible. His leadership was defined not by spectacle or aggression, but by intelligence, foresight, and meticulous orchestration. Lucchese had proven that strategic patience, perception, and subtle mastery could command loyalty, direct outcomes, and build a legacy that would endure across decades. Tommy Lucchese's story in this period demonstrates the enduring power of quiet authority. By aligning human behavior with opportunity, timing with execution, and alliances with long-term strategy, he built an empire that was resilient, adaptive, and quietly dominant. His influence shaped decisions, guided loyalty, and created a legacy that defined organized crime in New York. Lucchese illustrated that true power lies not in visibility or aggression, but in foresight, precision, and the calculated orchestration of influence across multiple spheres. The streets of New York seemed to hum with a rhythm all their own, a rhythm that Tommy Lucchese had learned to interpret, navigate, and manipulate with extraordinary skill. Beneath the clamor of daily life, the streetcars, the vendors, the hurried footsteps of ordinary men and women, ran a quieter, more potent current, a network of influence, negotiation, and control that shaped the city in ways most could not perceive. Lucchese had long understood that true power did not require visibility. It required foresight, patience, and the ability to orchestrate outcomes with precision. By the late 1950s, he had solidified an empire that spanned labor unions, entertainment, legitimate business ventures, and clandestine operations, each facet seamlessly integrated into a single, disciplined structure. Lucchese's influence was rooted in subtlety and strategy. He understood that authority could be exerted without overt displays of force. Perception, carefully guided and managed, could achieve results that intimidation alone could not. Those within his sphere often acted in alignment with his objectives, sometimes without ever realizing it. This quiet manipulation of perception became one of his most formidable tools, allowing him to control outcomes across multiple domains simultaneously. Every conversation, decision, and interaction was measured, contributing to an invisible but powerful architecture of influence. Labor unions remained central to his empire. Through unions connected to shipping, construction, and garment industries, Lucchese exerted control over contracts, labor flows, and business negotiations. These unions were not merely revenue streams. They were instruments of strategic influence, capable of shaping the city's economic landscape to his advantage. Trusted lieutenants executed daily operations while providing Lucchese with accurate and timely intelligence. Deviations or errors were corrected immediately, reinforcing the perception of his omnipresence and command. The unions functioned as both economic engines and levers of power, ensuring that his authority remained resilient and adaptable. The entertainment sector provided another layer of strategic advantage. Nightclubs, theaters, and private venues were carefully curated and managed to generate income and serve as venues for observation, negotiation, and influence. Lucchese understood that social leverage was as powerful as economic control. Politicians, business leaders, and cultural figures frequented these spaces, often unaware that their decisions and interactions were subtly guided to align with Lucchese's objectives. Through these venues, he integrated multiple dimensions of influence, social, economic, and clandestine, creating a network that was both effective and largely invisible. Observation of human behavior remained a cornerstone of his strategy. Lucchese could detect hesitation, shifts in tone, subtle gestures, and micro-expressions that revealed intention, ambition, or fear. These insights allowed him to anticipate challenges, exploit opportunities, and maintain loyalty with exacting precision. Deception or betrayal was rarely tolerated, and those who miscalculated soon discovered the consequences. His ability to read and respond to behavior functioned both defensively and offensively, deterring disloyalty while guiding outcomes without the need for overt confrontation. Rival families often misjudged him, interpreting his calm, measured demeanor as weakness or indecision. In truth, his restraint was a strategic choice. Lucchese understood that overt aggression could provoke retaliation, draw law enforcement scrutiny, and destabilize his organization. Patience, negotiation, and selective application of force allowed him to maintain authority while minimizing risk. When action was necessary, it was executed decisively, with precision, and often with irreversible effect, sending clear messages to both allies and rivals. This balance of restraint and decisive intervention reinforced his reputation as a master strategist rather than a mere enforcer. Alliances were carefully cultivated across the five families and beyond. Lucchese recognized that organized crime depended as much on cooperation as on competition. Deals were negotiated with foresight, grounded in mutual benefit, and reinforced by his reputation for intelligence and planning. Alignment with him offered tangible advantages, while defiance carried risk. These alliances enabled him to consolidate power, reduce conflict, and create a network that extended his influence far beyond immediate territory. Even those outside his inner circle understood that collaboration with Lucchese was a rational, often essential choice. Political and law enforcement connections augmented his authority. Lucchese treated these relationships as instruments for operational stability rather than merely as shields. By cultivating loyalty, offering strategic favors, and maintaining discreet channels of communication, he gained intelligence, anticipated investigations, and preserved continuity in operations. These networks allowed him to operate effectively, projecting legitimacy while controlling clandestine operations with precision. Strategic integration of political and law enforcement influence increased the resilience and flexibility of his empire, allowing him to navigate challenges with foresight and control. Timing and patience defined Lucchese's decision-making. He assessed situations carefully, evaluated risks, and waited for moments where intervention would yield maximum advantage. When action was required, it was executed with speed, precision, and authority, leaving rivals little room to respond. This combination of foresight and decisive execution created an aura of inevitability around his decisions. Loyalty was rational, opposition was dangerous, and outcomes seemed predetermined. Lucchese's strategic patience, coupled with his ability to act decisively when necessary, ensured the stability and continuity of his empire. The structure of Lucchese's operations reflected meticulous planning. Every component, from unions to entertainment, gambling, and legitimate business, was aligned with strategic objectives. Delegation empowered trusted lieutenants to manage day-to-day operations, while Lucchese maintained oversight and controlled critical decisions. This balance of autonomy and supervision ensured efficiency, adaptability, and long-term stability. The organization could expand and respond to challenges without compromising cohesion or strategic intent, making it both formidable and enduring. Lucchese's personal presence reinforced his authority. Modest attire, measured speech, and calm confidence projected an aura of control without the need for ostentation. Unlike some contemporaries who relied on intimidation or visibility, his influence derived from reputation, strategic acumen, and precise orchestration of people and events. Misjudgment carried consequences. Loyalty was rewarded, while mistakes or disloyalty were met with calculated corrective measures. His quiet, controlled presence ensured operational continuity and reinforced the perception of his far-reaching influence. By this stage in his career, Lucchese's empire had become deeply entrenched in New York's social, economic, and criminal infrastructure. Decisions made in private offices, union halls, and nightclubs affected labor agreements, corporate strategies, and criminal dynamics across the city, yet the full scope of his influence remained largely unseen. His leadership was defined not by aggression or spectacle but by intelligence, foresight, and meticulous orchestration of outcomes. Lucchese had demonstrated that strategic patience, perception, and subtle mastery could command loyalty, direct outcomes, and build a legacy enduring for decades. Tommy Lucchese's story in this period illustrates the enduring power of quiet authority. By aligning human behavior with opportunity, timing with execution, and alliances with long-term strategy, he built an empire that endured, adapted, and dominated, quietly yet absolutely. His influence shaped decisions, directed loyalty, and established a legacy that defined organized crime in New York. Lucchese showed that true power resides not in visibility, notoriety, or aggression, but in foresight, precision, and the calculated orchestration of influence across multiple spheres. New York City was a world of contrasts, a place where wealth and poverty, legality and crime, ambition and desperation coexisted in a complex web. Tommy Lucchese had long learned to navigate this world with a deftness that few could match. By the late 1950s, he had established himself as one of the most influential figures in the city's underworld. Yet his power was rarely overt. Unlike some contemporaries who sought recognition through flamboyant displays of authority, Lucchese preferred subtlety, control, and precision. His empire, spanning labor unions, entertainment, legitimate business, and clandestine operations, was a network of influence and leverage that moved quietly but decisively, shaping outcomes across New York's social and economic landscape. Lucchese's strategy relied on a profound understanding of both human nature and structural opportunity. Authority, he knew, was more than direct command. It was the ability to guide perception, align incentives, and orchestrate events. Those within his sphere often acted according to his intentions without realizing the degree to which they were being influenced. This subtle manipulation of perception was one of his greatest assets, allowing him to achieve results that brute force alone could never accomplish. Every negotiation, every decision, and every interaction was calibrated to reinforce the inevitability of his influence and the coherence of his network. Labor unions remained a central instrument of his power. Through connections in the shipping, construction, and garment industries, Lucchese could sway contracts, control workflow, and exert influence over businesses across the city. These unions were not simply revenue streams. They were levers of power, shaping economic and operational decisions to his advantage. Trusted lieutenants ensured daily operations aligned with his strategic objectives, providing accurate information and maintaining discipline. Any deviation from directives was addressed swiftly, reinforcing the perception that Lucchese's reach extended to every level of the organization. This level of control maintained stability, loyalty, and operational efficiency, ensuring that his influence remained both durable and adaptable. The entertainment sector provided another avenue of authority. Nightclubs, theaters, and private venues were carefully curated to serve as sources of revenue, observation, and strategic networking. Lucchese understood that influence was not confined to control over labor or business. It extended to social leverage. Politicians, business leaders, and cultural figures frequented these venues, often unaware that their decisions and interactions were being subtly guided to align with his objectives. Through these spaces, he expanded his influence beyond traditional criminal domains, integrating social, economic, and clandestine operations into a cohesive and highly effective network. Observation of human behavior remained one of Lucchese's most powerful tools. He noticed subtle cues, microexpressions, shifts in tone, changes in posture that revealed intention, ambition, or fear. This insight allowed him to anticipate challenges, exploit opportunities, and enforce loyalty with precision. Deception or betrayal carried significant consequences, and those who miscalculated quickly learned that his foresight left little room for error. Lucchese's ability to read people functioned both defensively and offensively, guiding outcomes without overt confrontation and reinforcing the inevitability of his influence. Rival families often underestimated him, mistaking his measured demeanor for passivity or indecision. In truth, his restraint was tactical. Lucchese understood that visible aggression often provoked retaliation, attracted law enforcement attention, and destabilized internal operations. Patience, negotiation, and selective application of force allowed him to maintain authority while minimizing risk. When decisive action was necessary, it was swift, precise, and impactful, sending unmistakable messages to allies and rivals alike. This combination of restraint and action solidified his reputation as a master strategist rather than a mere enforcer. Strategic alliances were essential to Lucchese's dominance. He recognized that the structure of organized crime required both cooperation and competition. Negotiations were conducted with foresight, ensuring mutual benefit and reinforcing his reputation for intelligence and strategic thinking. Alignment with him offered tangible long-term advantages, while opposition proved costly. These alliances allowed him to consolidate power, mitigate conflict, and create a network that extended his influence across sectors and generations. Even those outside his immediate circle understood that collaboration with Lucchese was both practical and prudent. Political and law enforcement connections augmented his authority further. Lucchese treated these relationships as strategic assets, integrating them into his broader operations. By cultivating loyalty, providing selective favors, and maintaining discreet communication, he gained access to intelligence, anticipated investigations, and ensured continuity in his activities. These networks enhanced his ability to operate effectively, projecting legitimacy while maintaining control over clandestine operations. The strategic integration of political and law enforcement influence added resilience and flexibility to his empire, allowing him to navigate challenges with foresight and efficiency. Timing and patience were central to his methodology. Lucchese carefully observed developments, evaluated risk, and waited for moments where intervention would have maximum effect. When he acted, his decisions were decisive, swift, and final, leaving rivals little room to respond. This combination of strategic anticipation and execution created an aura of inevitability around his operations. Loyalty became rational, opposition risky, and the outcomes of his maneuvers seemed preordained. Lucchese's ability to act with precision when necessary ensured the stability and continuity of his empire. The structure of Lucchese's operations reflected meticulous planning and organization. Every facet, labor, entertainment, gambling, and legitimate businesses, was aligned with broader strategic objectives. Delegation empowered trusted lieutenants to manage day-to-day operations, while Lucchese retained oversight over critical decisions. This balance of autonomy and supervision created an organization that was both efficient and resilient, capable of expansion while maintaining cohesion. Operational challenges were managed without jeopardizing long-term goals, ensuring the empire's continued growth and dominance. Lucchese's personal presence reinforced his authority. Modest clothing, measured speech, and calm confidence projected control without ostentation. Unlike some contemporaries who relied on intimidation or visibility, his influence derived from reputation, perception, and the precise orchestration of people and events. Men who misjudged him quickly discovered the consequences. Loyalty was rewarded, while mistakes or disloyalty were met with calculated corrective measures. His quiet but commanding presence ensured operational continuity and reinforced the perception of his far-reaching power. By this point, Lucchese's empire had become deeply integrated into New York's economic, social, and criminal fabric. Decisions made in private offices, union halls, and entertainment venues affected labor agreements, corporate strategy, and organized crime dynamics. Yet the full scope of his influence remained largely invisible to the public. His leadership was defined by intelligence, foresight, and the meticulous orchestration of outcomes rather than aggression or spectacle. Lucchese had demonstrated that strategic patience and subtle mastery could command loyalty, direct outcomes, and build a legacy that endured across decades. Tommy Lucchese's story in this era illustrates the enduring power of quiet, calculated authority. By aligning human behavior with opportunity, timing with execution, and alliances with long-term strategy, he constructed an empire that endured, adapted, and quietly dominated. His influence shaped decisions, directed loyalty, and established a legacy that defined organized crime in New York. Lucchese showed that true power resides not in visibility, notoriety, or brute force, but in foresight, precision, and the careful orchestration of influence across multiple domains. New York City had always been a city of contrasts, gleaming towers juxtaposed with shadowed alleys, prosperity alongside struggle, and legality mingling with crime. By the late 1950s, Tommy Lucchese had emerged as one of the most formidable and enigmatic figures in the city's underworld. Yet unlike many contemporaries, his authority was not forged through spectacle or flamboyance. Lucchese's power was quiet, calculated, and precise, built on strategic foresight, meticulous organization, and an almost intuitive understanding of human nature. His empire, spanning labor unions, entertainment, legitimate business ventures, and clandestine operations, was a vast network of influence that moved like a hidden current beneath the surface of the city. Lucchese had learned early that influence extended beyond direct command. True authority depended on shaping perception, guiding behavior, and orchestrating outcomes in ways that often went unnoticed. Those within his sphere of influence frequently acted in alignment with his objectives, sometimes without realizing the full extent of his involvement. This mastery over perception allowed him to control outcomes far more efficiently than intimidation alone ever could. Every alliance, every negotiation, and every decision was a deliberate move in a broader strategic framework, ensuring that his power remained both enduring and adaptable. Labor unions were one of his most potent instruments. Through carefully cultivated ties to unions in shipping, construction, and the garment industry, Lucchese wielded influence over contracts, workforce allocation, and business decisions. These unions were more than mere sources of income, they were levers of power, shaping New York's economic landscape in ways that often went unnoticed by the public. Trusted lieutenants executed the daily operations of these unions, while providing Lucchese with precise intelligence. Any deviation from expected outcomes was addressed swiftly, reinforcing the perception of his omnipresent authority and ensuring loyalty, efficiency, and compliance. Entertainment venues offered both profit and strategic advantage. Nightclubs, theaters, and private establishments were carefully curated spaces where Lucchese could observe, negotiate, and cultivate influence. Politicians, business leaders, and cultural figures frequented these venues, often unaware of the subtle guidance influencing their decisions and interactions. By blending social engagement with economic control, Lucchese extended his power beyond traditional criminal domains. These venues became a stage for observation, alliance building, and discreet negotiation, integrating multiple dimensions of influence into a cohesive network that was both effective and largely invisible. Observation and interpretation of human behavior were at the core of Lucchese's leadership. He detected micro-expressions, tone shifts, hesitation, and subtle gestures that revealed intentions, ambition, or fear. This insight allowed him to anticipate challenges, exploit opportunities, and enforce loyalty with precision. Those who attempted deception or betrayal quickly learned that miscalculation in Lucchese's presence could be costly. His ability to read people functioned as both defense and offense, guiding outcomes without resorting to overt displays of power, reinforcing the perception that his influence was both inescapable and absolute. Rival families often underestimated him, misinterpreting his calm demeanor as indecision. In reality, his restraint was deliberate. Lucchese understood that aggressive displays often provoked retaliation, attracted law enforcement scrutiny, and destabilized operations. Patience, negotiation, and selective use of force allowed him to maintain authority while minimizing risk. When action was required, it was executed with precision, decisiveness, and often irreversible effect. This balance of patience and action reinforced his reputation as a master strategist rather than a mere enforcer. Strategic alliances were crucial to Lucchese's sustained dominance. He recognized that organized crime was not merely a contest of territory, but a network of mutually beneficial relationships. Agreements were negotiated with foresight and pragmatism, ensuring long-term advantage while discouraging opposition. Aligning with Lucchese offered tangible benefits. Challenging him carried significant risk. These alliances consolidated his power, minimized conflict, and expanded his influence across sectors and generations. Even those outside his immediate organization understood that collaboration with Lucchese was often the wiser, more rational course. Political and law enforcement relationships further reinforced his authority. Lucchese treated these connections as strategic tools, integrating them into his operations rather than relying solely on protection or bribery. By cultivating loyalty, providing selective favors, and maintaining discreet communication, he gained early intelligence, anticipated investigations, and ensured operational continuity. These networks enabled him to operate with efficiency and discretion, projecting legitimacy while maintaining control over clandestine operations. Strategic integration of these relationships enhanced resilience and flexibility, allowing him to navigate challenges with foresight and authority. Timing and patience defined his decision-making. Lucchese observed situations, analyzed risk, and waited for moments where intervention would yield the greatest advantage. When he acted, it was swift, precise, and irreversible, leaving rivals with little opportunity to counteract. This combination of foresight and decisive execution created an aura of inevitability around his operations. Loyalty became rational, opposition risky, and outcomes seemingly predetermined. Lucchese's ability to align timing, strategy, and execution ensured both stability and continuity across his empire. The architecture of his operations reflected meticulous planning. Each component, labor, entertainment, gambling, and legitimate business, was aligned with broader strategic objectives. Delegation empowered lieutenants to manage daily affairs, while Lucchese retained control over critical decisions. This balance of autonomy and oversight created a disciplined, adaptable, and resilient organization capable of expansion without sacrificing cohesion. Challenges were managed efficiently, ensuring long-term stability and operational success, while strategic foresight maintained the empire's dominance. Lucchese's personal demeanor reinforced his authority. Modest attire, calm speech, and measured confidence projected control without ostentation. Unlike some contemporaries who relied on visibility or intimidation, Lucchese's influence derived from reputation, precision, and subtle orchestration of events. Misjudgment was costly. Loyalty was rewarded, while errors or disloyalty were met with calculated corrective measures. His quiet but commanding presence ensured operational continuity and reinforced the perception of his far-reaching power. By the conclusion of this era, Lucchese's empire had become deeply entrenched in New York's economic, social, and criminal frameworks. Decisions made in private offices, union halls, and entertainment venues influenced labor agreements, corporate strategies, and organized crime dynamics across the city. Yet the full scope of his influence remained largely unseen. Leadership was defined not by spectacle or aggression, but by intelligence, foresight, and meticulous orchestration of outcomes. Lucchese had proven that strategic patience, perception, and subtle mastery could command loyalty, direct outcomes, and build a legacy enduring for decades. Tommy Lucchese's story culminates as a testament to the enduring power of quiet, calculated authority. By aligning human behavior with opportunity, timing with execution, and alliances with long-term strategy, he constructed an empire that endured, adapted, and quietly dominated. His influence shaped decisions, guided loyalty, and established a legacy that defined organized crime in New York. Lucchese demonstrated that true power resides not in visibility, notoriety, or brute force, but in foresight, precision, and the subtle orchestration of influence across multiple domains, a legacy that would echo through the city's history for generations to come.